I lived alone in a small house in New Zealand, far away from the biggest region, Auckland. This all happened around 6.5 years ago, so some parts may be altered as I can't vividly remember this instant, when quite frankly, I should. This was one of the scariest incidents that have ever occurred in my lifetime, even until now. It all started one morning when I decided to open my front door and go buy groceries I'd forgotten to purchase the day before. Instead, I found the strangest thing waiting for me outside. Lying in the center of my doorstep was a small USB flash drive. At first, I was confused and took a second to look around if anyone was pranking me. You know how teens are these days, I thought. But when the outside of my house was dead silent, the questions began to flood through my head. Who put that there? Was the obvious first thought. It was just a generic USB stick, no label or anything. I would imagine no one would waste their time walking up to my house, placing it on my doorstep, but exactly that had just happened. There was no way to know where it came from, or who dropped it, or if they purposely did so for the sole purpose of someone curious enough and lacking common sense to plug it in. Well, I did exactly what I thought anyone else would have done. I took it inside and thought it would be a smart idea to plug it into my computer. The device was full of pictures. In fact, nothing but pictures. Dozens of them filling every tiny space that USB could hold. I then opened the first picture and clicked through all of them in order. The first few were just shots from around town. General places that I recognized and passed through sometimes when I was taking my morning stroll around the park. The fourth image was taken in our town's busiest street. In the image, the street was full of people, but there was somebody in that photo that caught my attention immediately. Me. The image showed me amongst the crowd, just minding my own business buying groceries for my barbecue a day ago. Well, at first I thought, this was a small town. Was it just a coincidence I was in the picture? The fifth image had been taken on the same day. Again, it was in our town, and again, I was in it. The photographer was closer to me this time. A little too close, I thought. Whoever had been taking these pictures of me, I hadn't noticed them at all that day. Next came several more pictures of me, in various locations around town. Then something more chilling. A photo of a house. My house. It was nighttime in that image, and the living room light was on. I clicked through it to the next, and it was another picture of my house, this time taken even closer. Through the living room window, you could see me sitting on the couch on my phone. I could tell from the clothes I was wearing that it was taken the night before, right after I'd taken a shower. I had no idea that someone had been outside watching me. I kept clicking through the images on the drive, and photo after photo of me inside my house taken from just outside my window. After 20 or so pictures of me just inside my house, there came a real curveball. An image had been taken inside of my hallway. The man or woman or whoever was taking these pictures of me had been inside my house the night before. There were photos of my living room, now lightless and empty, obviously taken after I had gone to sleep. Photos of my kitchen, of my dining area, my stairwell, and several taken as the unknown figure ascended my stairs towards where I was sleeping. My brain started to run wild with thoughts about who had been following me. Had I wronged someone in the past? Said something to the wrong guy? Was this just some weirdo who decided to target me? Were they armed when they came to pay me a visit? Whatever the case may be, somebody had come inside of my house at night, taken pictures of all my rooms, including my bedroom. The second to last picture was of me, fast asleep in bed, totally oblivious to the person in my home. The final image was just a handwritten note framed in close-up. The message read simply, "Never hide a spare key under your doormat. I have since moved homes." I recently moved into a new apartment with my partner, who works away for long periods of time. An older man about 50 years old started to become friendly with me, knowing I was new to the complex. I made the mistake of telling him I live with my partner and that he's away at work for a while. Almost every day after that, he came knocking on my door and waiting if I didn't answer. He would usually leave after about 5 minutes of knocking with no answer. One time, I was out in the common grass area playing with my 2-year-old brother that I would occasionally have over. I saw him coming up my way and quickly picked up my brother. The man started making conversation, asking about my brother, and at that point, tried to grab him out of my arms. I held on to my brother tight and pulled away as he started to cry, but I made the excuse that I had to go feed him and walked away. And that was definitely the last time I'd ever let that man near my brother. But I'm extremely bad with confrontation, as you can tell. A few days later, I heard a knock at my door and opened it without thinking. He walked straight past me into my apartment without saying a single word, just smiling. I asked him if he was doing okay, and he just replied, "I'm good, just wanted to see what your place looked like from the inside." He started walking into every room, checking all of my windows. Eventually, he commented, so all your windows have bars on them except for the bathroom." I laughed nervously and said, "Yeah, I guess." I didn't know what to do, so I walked out into the front garden, hoping he would try to follow me out. I just wanted him out, and I was scared to anger him as I could tell he didn't seem like he was right in the head. That night, while I was hanging my clothes, another neighbor introduced herself. I told her what had been happening with that man, and asked him if she knew him. Apparently, he had been doing the exact same things to her. She told her partner that this creepy neighbor was doing the same thing to a younger girl, which was me, and I guess that was his last straw. He ended up going up and talking to this older man. After that, the old man only tried one more time to knock on my front door. But since then, I haven't heard anything since, and haven't even seen him around. Sometimes I do wake up at night panicking, thinking he's planning on doing something to me. In 2017, I had heard news of people dressing up as clowns and running around with knives at night. I typically brushed those things off, though, because I had my own problems at the time. I was 20 years old and often up all hours of the night, dealing with my screaming newborn. It was in the early months of the year, so we still had some snow, and I wasn't able to get out of the house often. Taking out the trash, which was located at the back door, was usually the most fresh air I got. One morning when I was taking out the trash, I happened to glance over to the right and noticed footprints directly under the window to my baby's room. I walked over to inspect, and not only were those footprints, but there was also hand indentations on the window screen. It was weird, but the baby slept in my room, so I wasn't as concerned. But at that moment, my boyfriend was losing his marbles. Fast forward a couple days, and I was up around 3 a.m., and I heard not exactly what I would call screaming, but more of a screeching howl. We have a lot of stray cats, and I kind of thought that that's what it was and just ignored it. Once the sun was up, I looked out the window and noticed a few new sets of footprints that really didn't make sense because it looked like someone had just gone passing between the houses. But again, I blew it off because we had a drug house across the street and we've had people cross through our yard before to get to that house. Maybe 4 nights later, again at 3 a.m., I was breastfeeding, and I heard a dragging noise against the house. From where I was sitting on my couch, I could see the back door. The back door had a window with blinds on it, and it didn't really seal well due to the wood rot on the frame. I paused the TV and listened, just to hear it again, now directly at the back door. Looking over, I could clearly see a looming figure just standing there at the window. It was holding on to one of those big kitchen knives, and granted the blinds were shut, so I'm seeing a creepy shadow version of this. He ran the knife across the window panes before softly knocking. Meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out what to do. I have a newborn latched and my phone's in the bedroom, and something in me doesn't want whoever this is out of my sight. So I stood up and readjusted because I didn't want a screaming baby. I walked into the kitchen, flicked the light on, and just said loud enough for him to hear me, "Hey man, I called the police, and I'm sure you don't want to deal with them, so why don't you just go home?" I don't know why I talked to him so calmly and normally, but I don't think he was expecting anyone to say anything because he just froze. I think he talked it over with himself after, because he darted it down the alleyway. I've never had anything like this happen again, but my boyfriend was sure mad I didn't wake him up to handle the situation, or at least actually call the police. I decided to drive to the largest forest in my county in hopes of getting back in touch with nature. Needing to clear my head, I asked the local forestry office the best place for a quick walk off the main trails. I was directed to this beautiful spot that was a little ways down the road. There was no reception with the rare bit of blue sky we get in the UK. I was glad I made the spontaneous trip, and I walked further down the path and I saw a clearing of trees to my right. Since the plan was to get closer with nature, I ventured into the trees off the beaten path. It was great. I explored the area, listened to the birds as they swooped from branch to branch. I even got a good 5-minute meditation in. I unexpectedly reached the sand road as I emerged from the trees, but decided to walk along it for a moment as I scanned for an entry into the forest on the other side. But as I looked around, I spotted a bra dangling from a bush near the road. Now, I'm aware people go into the forest for all sorts of reasons, but this did slightly put me on edge. As I turned around, I heard an electric car making its way up the road. By the time I heard it, it was less than 300 yards away. My instincts told me to hide or just avoid being seen, but there was no time, so I simply gave a polite nod as he passed and made his way in the opposite direction. He parked up behind me, just out of view. I began to make my way off the road, intending to explore further, but when I saw the car for a moment doing a 180 turn, then parking again, something told me to turn around and go back the way I came. As I made my way back onto the road, I spotted this man in a white shirt behind the bush the bra was hanging from. He was going in the direction I just changed course from. I crossed the road and made my way back into the forest I had arrived on the sand road from. When I got slightly further in, I turned around to check if the man continued to be in the opposite direction, but he didn't. Instead, I see it also cross the road and is making his way to the part of the woods I entered. By this point, I knew I was being followed. There was no way he coincidentally went one way and then turned to head into the part of the forest that I entered. But I kept my pace brisk rather than running. My physical health can go south quickly, but my knees are brittle and my ankles are weak. So rushing could cost me, especially since I still had to reach my car and drive away. As I traveled further away, he was still following. I was cursing my luck as I made my way to the end of the section of the forest. Just before the path, that was a large patch of grass and shrubbery. But as I looked back, I couldn't see him. I stopped for longer than I should have, just scanning the trees and listening intently. But I heard nothing and saw nothing. I made my way back onto the path with some relief and turned one last time to check the tree line. He wasn't there. I began considering if I was just overthinking the whole situation. But just as those thoughts crossed my mind, I saw the man emerge from the opposite side from where he was previously, at the edge of the tree line. He just stared at me. But I wasn't going to take any more chances, so I made my way down the path and back to my car. I made sure to get out of there quickly, and I knew he would have to head down the same tight country road. I reported the man to the forestry office, but there was not much they could do, so that was it. I'm glad I never went further into the forest, and I'm glad I followed my instincts. Otherwise, the only way back would have been through him, and only God knows what his intentions were. My wife's uncle, that we'll call Jay, bought some land just north of Spokane, Washington, with a friend of the family that we'll call Kay. They got it at a significant discount because a nearby aluminum smelter had polluted the ground and it was impossible to use the water beneath. They had set up 2 plots and each had a camper to live in. Jay had been getting progressively more paranoid and saying that people were stalking him and watching him in the trees. About 3 months into living there, a man wandering through the woods had an interaction with Jay and ended up attacking him and breaking Jay's jaw. Upon being arrested, the man said he was overcome with the desire to see if he could kill him in a single punch. Unfortunately, 2 months later, Jay was murdered in his sleep on the couch of his camper. Kay found him and immediately ran as far away as he could and called the police once he stopped. There was sufficient evidence on who did it, and they say they caught the killer, who was a 19-year-old boy who wanted to steal his bike. Kay was completely terrified at all times to be there alone. He had moved in with a family member until 8 months later, where he had nowhere else to go and had to return. He was in constant fear, and he finally convinced my pregnant wife and I to come and stay with him. The second I turned off the highway onto the property, I was overcome with a sense of dread. There was at least 250 crows covering the dirt road up into the property. I didn't sleep whatsoever the first night. All I could do was stare into the forest and just searching for the cause of my intense fear. The energy of this place was so uncomfortable, but I assumed it was just because I knew Uncle Jay was killed here. Even the days were eerie here. There was never a moment where I didn't feel watched. My wife and I always had this sense of fear, but especially after dark. Things sort of normalized for a while, until one day Kay began puking and feeling very lightheaded at the time. I took him to the hospital and they said he was fine, probably just the flu. 3 days after the anniversary of Jay's death, Kay came running out of the camper screaming that he couldn't breathe. 3 days after the date of Jay's death's anniversary, Kay came running out of his camper and just screaming that he couldn't breathe. It woke my wife and I up, and we ran out to see what was wrong. Kay had gotten into his car and floored it, crashing into a nearby tree. I ran up and peered through the window just to see the most intense and most primal fear I've ever seen in somebody's eyes. He was gasping and clutching at his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time and he was dead. We gave him CPR for 30 minutes until EMS arrived. He was gasping and clutching his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time and he was dead. We gave him CPR for 30 minutes until EMS arrived. But on July 10th, 1 year and 3 days after him and Jay moving there, they were both dead. Now it's only me and my wife alone on the property. Every moment living in fear and not understanding what had just happened here. I don't know why we didn't just leave right away. One day I came out to get fresh water from the drum that we kept, just to be greeted with one of the worst smells I have ever smelled. The water container had a 1-inch opening on the top, and inside the water was bits and pieces of chipmunks, like spines and heads. They didn't fall in. Something ripped them apart before putting them inside. The nights were always getting worse and worse. I never saw anything. I was just filled with unease and an intense fear. One night, my wife and I returned home to having the worst feelings we've ever felt. Everything looked different, although everything was right where we left it, but nothing seemed in place. When we were looking around, I suddenly see this orange long-haired cat sitting on a stump. The cat's eyes were so intense, fiery but almost glowing, but not quite. Then we started hearing branches snapping, pine needles crunching, and seemingly from every direction, while I'm just still staring at this cat frozen in fear. Suddenly a voice breaks out, echoing through the forest. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" I thought it was a little girl, but something was off. My wife yelled back, "Hello? Are you okay? Anybody?" We yelled back several times with no response. But then someone with the most intense, shrieking, evil-sounding voice of a woman started screaming, "Help me, help me." I was filled with more intense fear than I could ever describe, but my wife was overcome with the need to help this person, and she started to head off into the forest without a word. I grabbed her by the arm and told her something wasn't right. I don't know why she wouldn't respond to us, but she tried to break free from me and go off alone. I told her to get into the truck and that I'd grab the spotlights and we aren't going on foot. We rolled the windows down and shone the intensely bright LED lights through the forest. We slowly crept down the road yelling back, and as we got further down the road, we started hearing the screaming again. Sounds are difficult to pin down in the woods, but this one was very close. I hit the brakes and stopped immediately, still searching. No sign of anyone, when suddenly the voice exploded into the cabin of the vehicle as if they were standing right outside the window. It left my ears hurting and ringing. I hit the gas and just didn't look back. I called the police when I hit the highway, and afterwards they said that no one was around when they looked. I picked up our stuff the next day, and my wife gave birth shortly after. The one thing I'll always wonder is what the hell could have done these things. I've never believed in the paranormal before, but I don't have any other explanation for it. When I was in high school, me and a bunch of friends piled into my friend's car and drove up to some abandoned houses near our town. The houses were bought by a big company to tear them down to build more office space, but the project was abandoned and the houses were never torn down. They had been empty for about 20 years at that point. I really didn't want to go, but I had just gotten in with the cool crowd and I wanted to fit in, so I went along. The houses were falling apart, covered in graffiti and trash, and it was dead silent and pitch dark out. The only light we had was our cell phone flashlights. Most of us were terrified, but a few of the older boys were being rowdy and making a lot of noise. I told them to shut up because I didn't want the cops to come, and I knew this was a hot spot for squatters and didn't need us getting robbed and or murdered. The whole time I felt like I kept hearing stuff behind me, but I tried to brush it off thinking it was just my imagination. About the third house we went into, I found an old Victorian doll covered in dust and cobwebs on the staircase. I don't know why, but I picked it up to look at it. It was creepy as all hell. One eye missing and matted hair and torn clothing. I quickly put it down and walked away to continue exploring. A few minutes later, in dead silence, besides our footsteps, creaking on the old wooden floors, we heard Mama in a soft child's voice coming from the doll. I looked at my friends, they looked at me. We hightailed it back to the car and sped away. Never went back after that. This was either a doll with a pull string or you pressed its belly to talk. I don't remember. But no one was near the doll when it went off. I don't really believe in ghosts, so my logical mind wants to think I probably just knocked it when I put it down, or it was displaced a bit when all of us were walking around the house. But it was still creepy all nonetheless. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City is a beautiful place. It produces 75% of the world's cherries and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1889. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the buildings on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourist traps, cafes, and whatnot, but many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system, which the hospital staff use to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for or trying to justify my criminal act of B&E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightful, youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of those stories. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I never encountered anything supernatural in all my trips to the abandoned hospital. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something all too human that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m. The moonlight was dim, and most patrol guards had left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used. We followed our regular path to one of the tall jutting spires to sit by the windows, and it overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others. A new, faint, and unexplainable smoky odor. Not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint, we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard that his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloodied bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind, I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear, stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers. Personally, I don't remember doing that, but I wouldn't be too terribly surprised though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not too sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us. Welcome, friends. I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way that guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be too crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The two men shouted for us to stop running. Obviously, we didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather been caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot, whether it was from the cause of fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of both. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during the summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't that close now as adults, I know this horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until the day we die. I was exploring an old abandoned hospital that was later a hospital for the mentally ill youth with some friends. It was located on a hill, in a wooded area removed from the nearby main roads, and we had to slip under a fence to access the property. Everything went pretty well for the most part of our exploration. There were some eerie remnants of its former life, like empty rooms with lone rocking horses, an old stage, and those weird metal bed things used for embalming, or perhaps just for washing patients down. On the 3rd or 4th floor, there was a room labeled morgue in spray paint. One of my buddies and I decided to go and check it out. Upon entry, it looked to be some sort of power control room with big fuses arrayed across a bunch of big control boards. We walked in for a closer look with our flashlights, when suddenly the big steel door slammed shut behind us. The thing no longer had a knob or handle on our side, so there was no way for us to get out. We started pounding somewhat anxiously on the door to get our other friends' attention, when I started hearing movement and fuses popping out of their sockets and clattering to the ground. Not long after, our friends heard us and were able to get the door open from the other side. That was kind of our cue to wrap things up, since the situation could have gotten pretty ugly if we didn't have other people in the place to hear us. As for the doors, noises, and fuses, in hindsight, I attributed them to natural phenomenon. Perhaps the door hinges were warped, and the banging on the door may have made some of the fuses pop out of the boards. It was still pretty damn creepy in the moment, though. I live in a house where I can't find much history of. All I know is that when my parents moved in, they found a pelvic bone and dirty magazines in the wall of the bathroom. Growing up, I've always seen a female spirit with long black hair, pale body, and around 5'6". I see her walking around the hallway, sitting in my old room, and all that sort of stuff. My mom has seen her too. She said she always thought it was me and the spirit are pretty similar looking. My mom would always tell me she would walk past my room at night and see her sitting on the edge of my bed, or would see her in the corner of her eye. This has been going on for 15 years since we moved in. I've gotten used to the spirit and don't see her much lately, but this is what really freaked me out. For the last 2 weeks, I've been hearing whistling. The whistling starts between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. The first time this happened, I was laying in bed on my phone. Suddenly, the whistling started. It sounded like a grown man was whistling outside my house. My house has only one neighbor next to us, and on the other side of the house is land. It's full of dirt and bush for a bit. My room is at the front of the house, so the window just shows the view of the front, and there is a field. After a minute, I built up the courage to look outside the window. Nothing was there, but it got extremely quiet and the whistling stopped. I got back into bed and it started again, sounding closer. After a few minutes, the whistling stopped again. The same thing would happen every night at the same time, but now I don't look out the window anymore. I have a feeling not to, like something was telling me it's not okay to look. Last night was different. As I was preparing for the whistling to start again, suddenly I heard a bang on the roof, followed by footsteps. This lasted a minute, and as soon as I thought it was over, I heard footsteps at my window. I laid still and physically could not move. I felt a negative energy and something just wasn't right. That's when my dog walked in and looked out the window. She normally is a loud dog and will bark when she hears noises and try to investigate. However, the look on her face made me even more scared. She jumped onto my bed and cuddled me. My dog has been very quiet today and will not go near my window. I have no idea what this is and what it wants. If anyone has any ideas or anything, please let me know. I'm a person who picks up on energy very easily, so this is maybe why I'm the only one experiencing this in my house. But whatever this is, I want it gone, and I want to know what it is. I recently stayed the night at my childhood home. It's an old house built in the 19th century. I never felt at ease in that house. It has an eerie vibe to it. When I was 17, my parents told me that they were able to afford this house, which was a mansion, because the previous owners wanted to desperately get rid of it. The reason being is that their son had hung himself in the attic. It happened last week. I stayed the night there because I had a football game that was close to where my parents were living. I didn't feel like waking up super early, so that's why I held a sleepover in my old bedroom. I went to sleep fairly early, around 10 p.m. or so. Everything felt normal. I made sure all the doors were locked, and my parents were on a wellness retreat in Germany, and my brother moved out a while ago, so it was just me in the house. I went to sleep feeling comfortable and quite at ease even though I was cautious. I texted some of my friends goodnight, and that was it. The comfortable feeling suddenly wore off when I was awoken at 3 a.m. I heard music playing, but it was muffled. I couldn't hear it clearly. My instinct was that it was a car playing music with its windows closed, parked on the street. I said to myself, give it 10 minutes and the car will pass. The music was still playing 10 minutes later. I felt annoyed and quite frankly pissed off. I had to wake up early, and this was ruining my sleep. I walked to my bedroom window to see where the music was coming from. I was ready to throw a fit. I opened my blinds, opened the window to look outside, and my stomach dropped. There was no car, nor was there anyone else outside. I realized the music was coming from the attic. My parents renovated the attic 5 years ago and made it into their bedroom. I knew it had a radio on my mother's bedside. She never used it, though most of the time it wasn't even plugged in, because she only had one socket and she used it to charge her phone. It was not a new radio. It was around early 2000s, I would guess. My mom held on to it because it was the radio of her departed father. She could not get rid of it. I was freaking out. Why would these kinds of encounters only happen when I'm home alone? I tried calling my parents, they didn't pick up, and my brother didn't pick up either. Not surprising since it was 3 in the morning. I realized that I would have to deal with this situation alone. I opened up my bedroom door and the music became louder. I could clearly hear what music was playing now. It was a dark organ music. My stomach dropped again. I never felt as scared as I did then. I did not want to do this alone. I had one last rescue line that I could call. It was my friend Philip. He played Call of Duty until the early hours, so he surely was still awake. I called him and explained the situation. He reassured me that it was probably a problem with the electric outlet, and it had jump-started the radio. I felt reassured by his answers and made the walk upstairs to the attic. I was on the phone with him the whole time. I stood in front of the door and I could clearly hear the music. It was so loud. I knew I had to get in to turn it off, but I was so frightened. Philip reassured me that everything was going to be all right. It was just faulty wiring, and that's what I kept repeating to myself. I opened the door. The music stopped. I ran downstairs, put on all the lights, and watched Trailer Park Boys until 7 a.m. I played the worst football game in history the next day. We lost 7-0. When I was about 10 or 11, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to move. It genuinely frightened me because I never heard of sleep paralysis, and I had no idea why I couldn't move. I kept looking around my room. It was dark, only lit up by the smallest bit of moonlight, and the light on my computer's power button, which added a greenish light to the room. As I looked around, I had the feeling I was being watched, but my heart sank in when I noticed a hand slowly reaching up from the foot of my bed. The best way to describe this hand was it was dark, skinny, and had fingers that were about a foot long each. Just to give a better description, my bed was a loft, meaning it was basically a bunk bed that didn't have a bottom half. The only thing under my bed was a computer desk. So I would have to climb to get into my actual bed. I noticed my bed starting to shake as the creature with the large, skinny hand slowly ascended. I couldn't move or even scream for my dad, so the only thing I could do was close my eyes. When I opened them, the creature was gone. However, seconds later, I saw my bed start to shake, and once again, that hand slowly rose up from the foot of my bed. I did the same thing, closing my eyes, only to open them up and see the figure was gone once again. But a few seconds later, as you probably guessed, the same thing happened again. At this point, I felt a bit more in control, knowing that if the creature gets too close, I can simply just close my eyes again. With this in mind, I guess I felt like I wanted to see how far he would come. So I kept my eyes open a bit longer. This time, the creature slowly makes its way onto my bed, and finally getting far enough to reveal his face. And his face was just disturbing. It was pale and cartoonish, but it would move as if it was running at like 20 FPS. It was not a face I could describe or even comprehend, and it did not match the dark, misty body it had. I was so terrified, and the fact that I couldn't even move made it all the more traumatizing for me as a kid. I felt trapped, and there was nothing I could do. Well, except for one thing. So once again, I closed my eyes and kept them shut for at least 15 seconds longer than usual. And at this point, I felt like the creature would have been long gone, so I felt safe to open my eyes. But when I did, I felt like my world came to an end as my heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. The creature was 2 inches away from my face. If I could scream, that would have been an appropriate action at the time, but I still couldn't move. I closed my eyes again, and when I opened them, he was gone, and I could move again. I felt a bit relieved that I could move, and I wanted to run to my parents' room across the hall, but I was still paralyzed. This time paralyzed with fear. I lay in my bed shaking, wondering what the heck just happened. Almost every night when I lay in bed, I would feel this gut-dropping, heart-pounding fear, and I would think I was just being ridiculous and afraid of the dark. But I could swear that I saw this young girl in my room in the shadows, usually under my bed. She had dark hair, pale skin, and big, wide black eyes. I would be almost hyperventilating under my covers, peeking out at her through my tiny breathing hole. I would lay there paralyzed in fear until I either eventually made a mad dash to my mom's bedroom, or inevitably fall asleep in my own bed. I couldn't work out if she was actually there or if it was just me being afraid of our creepy house and imagining things. I thought this because no one ever saw her but me. The years went by and these nightly creepy episodes continued. I felt like I was being terrorized by this girl, and all she ever did was stare at me. My bed was right next to a mirrored cupboard, so I could see her laying there, just inches away from me. Still makes my skin crawl thinking about it. But anyway, it somehow got even worse as time went by. I swear that she always seemed to be the same age as me. When I was small, so was she. When I was 12 and a bit taller, so was she. I got more and more scared of her, realizing this when I was about 15. I basically never slept alone at my mom's anymore. I was always visiting my dad, staying with friends, or having them over. I eventually forgot about the creepy girl and decided she must not have been real. After all, there were other ghosts here that other people saw, but nobody ever mentioned her. I also did have a very bad fear of the dark as a kid, so it must be it, right? I even started sleeping alone in my room after a while. That creepy feeling has always remained, but my mom's house always felt that way, and I just refused to look in that mirror at night ever again. Fast forward to now, and I'm in my early 20s. Life is good. I live in my own place that's not haunted, but unfortunately it doesn't end here. My mom called me in the morning as she usually does to say hi, but this time she sounded a bit off. She said, "You're gonna want to hear this. Something happened to Steve, her boyfriend, last night and it was really creepy." To cut the long story short, Steve isn't a ghost believer and has always tried to ignore the very obvious sounds at night. I think it just creeped him out too. Well, last night, my mom and him were watching TV on the couch where the footsteps were much louder than ever before. Steve tried to tell my mom that someone was upstairs in her house, and she started laughing. "Oh, it's just the ghosts. I've been telling you, they are real." Steve went a bit quiet then, probably trying to rationalize with himself that ghosts aren't real. Not long later, Mom went to bed, but Steve stayed up to watch more TV. After a while, the noises were too much for him, so he switched the lights off to go upstairs to bed. This is where it got real. From the shadows of the now dark living room, Steve saw a shape begin to approach him. He climbed the stairs, going faster and faster as the figure gained on him. It was the girl. He could see her clearly now. She followed a few meters behind him, all the way to Mom's bedroom. He was now basically running, and he shut the door firmly behind him, trying to escape to my mom's bed like I had many times as a kid. The door cracked open, and the girl stuck her head through the gap, looking straight at them for a long time, before slowly leaving and closing the door again. I asked my mom, all hair standing on ends now, how old was she? My mom said that Steve said she looked about in her early 20s. My stomach dropped and tears pricked me. So she is real, I whispered back. There was something very sinister about this ghost. I think that's why I'm so creeped out and upset that she was real. I was working at a steel fabrication shop for about 25 years. Our regular start time was 7:30 a.m., and when overtime was scheduled, we would work it prior to start time. We would go through periods where we would work overtime for months on end. So much, I wouldn't really need an alarm clock to wake up as my body was so used to it. I was in the middle of this period of overtime, starting work at 4 a.m. and working till 4 p.m. It took me about 45 to 50 minutes to get to work from my house. So I would wake up at 2:30 a.m., get dressed, pour a cup of coffee down my throat, and get another one for the road and go. I live in a rural area, so there is usually no one awake in my neighborhood at that time of the morning, except me. So I went out my back door to get to my 2000 Honda Civic, which was about 15 feet away and slightly to the right of my back door. And there was a woman sitting in the back seat. I stopped dead in my tracks, just watching her. She had long dark hair with a pale complexion, and was just sitting there. She was sitting in the driver's side back seat, not looking at me. I don't think she noticed me at all, and I was just paralyzed. She was looking out of the left-hand window, looking as someone who's riding in the car on a not-so-exciting drive. After probably a minute or two, her gaze drifted to the front windshield and still not at me. She just sort of melted into the back of the seat and disappeared. I told my wife later that day, and she just looked at me like, yeah, sure. Yes, it was dark, and at a time of day where sane people are sound asleep, but no, I wasn't dreaming or half asleep. My adrenaline was pumping as soon as her presence registered in my brain, and my heart was pounding. After I approached the car, shining my flashlight all over the interior, no one was there. We live in a mobile home. It's 12 by 30 and not a very big sitting room or kitchen, and it's combined with bedrooms separated by a door to the hallway. We have a 3-year-old and a 3-month-old. For the moment, we are taking turns sleeping on the couch with the baby in the cot, since the baby room is pending renovation. So our 3-year-old sleeps with us in the bedroom. Last night was my night on duty. My 3-year-old comes out every night when it's my turn. Nothing unusual there except last night it was at 2:50 a.m. I heard him running out crying to me, followed by my partner behind him. It was dark, so I could just see my partner standing in the doorway in his orange shirt. Well, I just assumed it was him. Though I couldn't see his features, it was dark with only the LEDs at the back of our TV lighting up the room. I tucked my little boy in beside me, and sat up looking at my partner. I shook my head at him, at our boy running out, and he didn't respond. I sat there thinking, why is he just standing there and looking at me? He then proceeded to step back and turn sideways behind the door, while bending forward looking in. Still thinking, what the hell is he doing? The idiot either come in or go back to bed. Until the realization hit me about 3 minutes later. My partner had gone to bed in a black shirt, and that was indeed not him standing there in an orange shirt. I jumped up to close the door, and as I approached, it just disappeared. When my partner got up for work at 6, he said he didn't even know our son got up last night, and he was indeed still wearing his black shirt. As I said, living in a mobile home, you hear and feel every footstep, especially my partner's, as he's very heavy-footed, but there was nothing, just silence, no footsteps. Nothing only from my little boy running out to me. This happened in July, I believe. It was around 1 a.m. and it was still about 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And where I live, AC isn't very common. So I was sitting in the living room with all the windows and doors open. I headed out to smoke, and since everything was open, I didn't want the house to smell like smoke, so I walked down the driveway and sat on the curb. There was a man standing on the same side of the street, but a block down, just staring at me. I got really uncomfortable, so I got up and crossed the road. The way my triplex is set up, there's a 3-car driveway, then a few stairs, and they lead up to the front yard, and then my door is on the right. I live somewhere with a lot of homeless people, and they come up the driveway to look in our trash for cans or whatever, and that's fine. They never go past the stairs. So I'm standing on the other side of the road, and I watch this man stand and stare at me. And then he proceeds to walk into my yard, and I start to panic, because I realized I didn't lock any of the doors and the windows are all open. So I start to walk down the street and I see a man who looks normal and I stop him. I asked if he could just pretend to know me. In retrospect, this wasn't my brightest decision, but whatever. So me and this man are just standing there talking, and I'm explaining the situation while we're both smoking a cigarette. I'm a few houses down now, and the man is peeking around the corner in the line of trees next to my place. He peeks around the corner a few more times and eventually walks up to me. I'm completely frightened, and I'm shaking as he asks me for a cigarette, and I hand him one. He asked me why I'm shaking and if I was scared. He walks away, and the other dude stands there for a bit longer with me, and then the scary man starts peeking around another corner, just staring at me again. The dude walks me to my house, and I just shut all the windows and doors and dealt with the heat. I'm grateful for the random dude, but I don't know what would have happened if he wasn't there. I moved in with my elderly grandmother a few months ago because I got a new job down the street from her house, and she said she'd be happy to have me stay with her. Some context. I used to come visit my grandmother about one weekend a month. About a year ago when I was visiting, one of her neighbors a couple houses down came to talk to us while we were sitting on the front porch. She informed us that the adult son of the man who lived across the street from them was mentally ill and a peeping Tom. Supposedly, he would come stand in the neighbor's yard and just stare into her windows. She got her husband to yell at him, and he kept doing it, so they eventually called the cops. My grandmother remarked that she had seen the cops at this man's house for years, and that it was a single dad who lived there with his adult son who struggled to manage his mental problems. Flash forward to a couple of weeks ago. Now living with my grandmother full-time, I got home after dark a couple of weeks ago, and the front door was cracked open. My grandmother is a bit of a safety freak, so she always has her doors locked. I was nervous but tried to keep hope for the best, thinking my grandmother had forgotten to close the door on the way in with the groceries. I go to her room and she said she was certain the door was locked. I tried not to worry about it since nothing was moved or stolen. The next day when I got home, her car door was cracked open. At this point, I assumed both instances were her, and that she was just being forgetful. However, she's never left either of those things open before. Well, tonight my grandmother and I were going out for dinner, and therefore I'm the one who locked the front door on the way out. She has a doorknob lock and a deadbolt lock above it. I distinctly remember struggling to lock the deadbolt, and they both use the same key. Sometimes you have to shimmy the door to get the deadbolt to lock, but I got sick of trying and just left it unlocked. And I was satisfied with the doorknob being locked. As I walked away from the door, I thought to myself, I hope no one breaks in. Well, we got back from dinner, and I go to unlock the doorknob, and to my surprise, the door wouldn't open because the deadbolt somehow had been locked. It was at that moment I immediately knew someone had been going into the house while we were gone, and locked the deadbolt back when they left. Once again, nothing had been moved or stolen. The creepy part about this person is they're intentionally leaving doors open and locking back locks that were never locked on purpose, just to creep us out. And he was obviously watching us out of his window to see when we left tonight. I feel certain that it's this mentally ill man, and he must have gotten a hold of a key that my grandmother hid under the mat or something. Why would anyone do this? If it was a robber, they would have just taken something. I'm going to get the locks changed as soon as possible and install a Ring doorbell camera. What I'm most nervous about is once I get the locks changed, this guy, or whoever it is, will know that we're onto them and get mad they won't have access to their twisted pastime anymore. We live in a gun-friendly state, although we don't own any, but I'm afraid of what this guy may do in retaliation. The neighbor who had the peeping Tom incident called the cops on him, and she's still alive, so I just hope he leaves us alone and doesn't bother us anymore. In June of this year, I moved out of my parents' apartment, as I finally got a steady job and longed for some sort of freedom. I looked for apartments that were affordable in my city, and found one that's a 2 or 3 minute walk from my parents' apartment. To me, it was perfect. I'd get to live alone, and my parents would still be nearby so I could visit them whenever I wanted to or pop in to have breakfast with them. The apartment itself is great. It's not really much to look at, but for a single male, it's more than enough. My apartment has a long corridor connecting each room together from the sides, with my front door being at the start of the corridor. My bedroom is the second room on the left, and since the walls are pretty thin, you can hear anyone in the apartment complex walking and talking. Last week I came home from the pub after meeting a few friends. It was really late and around 10:15 or 10:30ish. I had the day off, so I took a shower and hopped into bed to watch Netflix. It was probably around midnight when I heard a faint knocking coming from the front door. I stopped the show I was watching and listened for a minute or so. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. I continued watching Netflix, and once again, I heard a 2-motion knock on my door. I sat up from my bed and went to the door and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, it was pitch black. I once again shrugged it off and went back to my room. But before I could even sit down properly, I heard it again, but slightly louder. At this point, I thought it was my friends playing a prank on me, so I called my friend and asked him if he was knocking at my door. And if he was, it wasn't amusing. He paused for a second and just said he had to be up at 7:30 and that he was at home. I was talking pretty loud, so whoever was knocking probably heard me, and as soon as I hung up, I heard another knock. At this point, I was pretty pissed off, so I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw nothing. I then unlocked the door and took a peek and closed the door and locked it. Me being angry and a bit intoxicated, I decided to wait and catch whoever was knocking, so I spent a solid 10 minutes silently looking through the peephole before being a bit startled as someone put their hand over the peephole and knocked again. I immediately started unlocking the door and ran out to the apartment hall. I heard someone booking it down the hall and heard him supposedly lean against the wall with his jacket shrugged. So I ran a few steps down before realizing that whoever this is, he was waiting behind the corner to get the jump on me. I hurried back inside and called the cops. They were there within a few minutes and scanned the building and streets and couldn't find anyone. They told me that it could have been some kids pulling a prank and to never run after someone. They kept the patrol car around the entire night and the knocking stopped. Could have been some kids being dumb, but the part that gave me the creeps was the fact that whoever it was ran down the stairs and stopped behind the corner. He didn't keep running. If it were some pranksters, I'd find it more likely that they would have just booked it outside. And as I said, it's been a week and the knocking stopped. It kept me on edge for a few days because I expected to be jumped by someone when walking to my apartment, but so far nothing has come of it. I've let it go and just hope it won't happen again. Retired paramedic here. I had a call on a very desolate stretch of road for a car sitting in the middle covered in blood. Of course it has to happen at 2 a.m., just like every other horror story. We arrive on scene and find a new Camaro sitting in the middle of the road that had obviously been in an accident. The problem is, there is absolutely nothing else around the car. No persons, no other vehicles, nothing. Part of my job then was a tactical paramedic for our sheriff's department. It sounds all exciting and high-speed, low-drag, but nope, not as a medic. I got paid to wait for stuff to happen and sit in the rear with the gear. This being said, my paramedic partner and I both had pistols in the ambulance. As we start approaching the Camaro, my partner is shining a light around when he says in a really low and hushed voice for me to get back, and now. I shine my light into the car, and there were intestines wrapped around the gear shifter and a lung in the back seat. So we kind of freak out and call dispatch to let them know what's going on, and that we're in the process of getting out of there until the cops show up. This is when we see a figure appearing down the road towards us. As he gets closer, we see his face covered in blood and gore. We both threw on our tactical vests, helmets, and snatched our pistols as I sounded like a frightened Home Alone 9-year-old on the radio to dispatch. We approach and start screaming at him to get onto the ground, which he does, and after everyone's heart rate is below 200 BPM, we start talking and figure out what happened. This guy had purchased a brand new Camaro and drove it down the stretch of road to open it up. He said 1 minute he's shifting gears, and the next all he knows is his car's all over the road and has a mouthful of blood. It seemed like an explosion had gone off. I start to look at his injuries over, and I can't really see anything major. And I ask him about the passenger in the car. He says, "What passenger?" My partner says that there's a lung in your back seat. Dude goes straight into mental overload and can't come up with anything, so I'm thinking he's hurt. We get him to the ambulance. Police are 5 minutes away, and we potentially have another victim out there. I have to go look by myself. I walk through the crash scene, look in the car, and sure enough, intestines are wrapped around the gear shifter, lungs in the back seat, and what looks like a part of the liver, and a hand grenade went off inside the car. I walk around the other side of the car and see a faint blood smear/stain on the road. walk to it, and it seems like something else further down the road, so I keep walking towards it. I finally see something on the side of the road and run up to it. Honestly, I was completely freaked out and scared to death about the body I was about to see. And then I realized the dude had hit a deer. What happened is when he was winding the car out, state police estimated him going over at 100 miles per hour. A deer jumped into his car pathway and hit the top corner of the windshield with its stomach. When the windshield crashed, it created a negative vacuum in the car, sucked almost all the deer organs out into his car and all over him. I had the fire department decontaminate him, wrapped him in some blankets, and took him to the hospital. At the hospital where I did my internship, there was supposedly a haunted elevator. The residents there say that sometimes when they would go to the higher floors and use the elevator, it would sometimes go to the basement first and open despite having no one down there. From there, a child-sized shadow would get on. They would say you shouldn't look at the shadow directly if you didn't want anything to happen to you. They also said that the shadow would get off at the 3rd floor, where the ICU was, and whenever it did, someone would die amongst the ICU patients shortly after. So they said the child shadow was actually escorting patients to the afterlife. I never believed that story until my pediatrics rotation. When I used the elevator to go to the 6th floor, the elevator went to the basement first and opened. It was the first time that had ever happened to me, and I was so tired that night, I forgot about the stories. So I idly looked at the basement while waiting for the doors to close. It was more of a storage floor, medical records of patients, old cabinets, an old mop squeezer bucket, battered sofa, and where the janitors sometimes rested. Then the doors closed, and I felt the elevator shudder slightly. It was as if someone heavy had gotten on. And from my peripheral vision, the right side of the elevator was dark. I immediately remembered the stories, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Please, I'm just doing my rounds. Please, I'm just doing my rounds." Then the elevator moved up again. It stopped, and the doors opened. I had felt something brush against my arms, and then the doors closed again. I opened my eyes and saw that the elevator had just left the 3rd floor. As I continued my rounds a short while later, the code blue at the ICU was announced on the PA system. I'm a 25-year-old female, and I work night shift at a maximum security psychiatric hospital. As you can probably imagine, these kinds of experiences come with the territory. To set the scene for you, the hospital I work at was built in the 50s as an asylum. The concrete walls are cold, and sounds echo throughout them with relative ease. We typically keep the lights out to encourage patients to sleep throughout the night. And then there's me, walking through the halls to check and make sure everyone's still breathing. I've heard people laughing to themselves, whispering conversations to someone unseen by me. I've even ran to emergencies where other patients have snuck into another's room to beat them violently. And I've had to pull a 300-pound man off of another man while he attacked him in his sleep, while still stomping on his head. But the scariest thing was when I was doing a round and I came across one of our blind patients. You know how in movies you'll see people with hallucinations that cut their eyes out looking for a leaf? No, I didn't find a pair of peepers freshly gouged out. However, this patient had in fact done the exact same thing a number of years ago, and as a result, he's completely blind. The worst part is, it didn't make the hallucinations go away. Now all he can see are the haunting visions that brought him in the first place. So this patient had been with us for some time, and every night I would walk through his room. He would be in the same position, standing, facing the wall with his back to the door. No matter how long I stood there, he wouldn't move. This is nothing new, as I've seen a number of patients with catatonia before. They just stand and sit there with a blank or sometimes fearful expression and react to nothing. So the scary part for me was when I passed by his room, walking quietly as to not wake any patients, I peek into his room through the window. He's just standing facing the wall. And just before I could continue on with my rounds, I see his head turn, like he had heard a voice. He turns around with his empty eye sockets and looks at me. "Anya, is that you?" It completely frightened me. I didn't even know this patient knew my name, let alone if he could tell somehow that it was me standing there. I should have reassured him that I was real, but at that moment, I was so scared I just kept walking. It was early 2020, and I had just gotten a new job in a small town near my area. While looking for a place to live, my sister offered to rent her house to me. She had bought the house 2 years prior, but she and her husband didn't really take to it, and their commute to work was long, so they moved out and the house was inhabited. Luckily for me, it was actually pretty close to my place of work, around 45 minutes. And my sister pretty much rented it to me for free. I just paid for water and electricity and looked after the house. I was living there for a solid 2 or 3 months and had already gotten used to it. One night, after coming back from work and parking my car, as I walked towards the door, I noticed something odd. There was a cigarette butt on the curb to my house. I leaned down, picked it up thinking it might have been one of mine since I was a smoker, but after looking at the brand name, I realized it wasn't mine and threw it away. I didn't think much of it and just shrugged it off as someone throwing it on my curb. I went on with my night and nothing unusual happened. 2 days later, I was once again walking to my house when I spotted a few more cigarette butts. This time near my porch. Needless to say, I was pissed off and thought someone sat on my porch and smoked, but since I didn't know who it was, there was nothing I could do about it. I noticed that they were put out pretty recently, so whoever it was probably walked off as I was approaching. That night I was watching a movie on my laptop and it was pretty late, past 1 a.m. So I was surprised when I heard a car passing by. It's a suburban neighborhood and it was COVID time, so people rarely ventured out at night and I didn't think much of it. Around half an hour later, I was surprised when I heard chatting nearby. I listened intently, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about as the voices seemed almost muffled and quiet. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off my sofa and walked to the front door to make sure it was locked. As I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two approaching my porch and reduced their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that whoever this was wanted to break in. I leaned against my front door and waited, expecting a loud bang, or the knob being shaken, but it was oddly quiet. I decided to walk over to my window to see if they had walked away or changed their minds. My windows have bars from the inside out, so you would have to unlock them if you wanted to move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up. I moved the curtains and was taken aback. Leaning up against a window was a man. He was as startled as I was because he basically studded over his own steps as he jumped back. He tightened his hood over to cover his face, so all I could see was this big blue eyes looking at me. His friend realized what was going on and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked the door a solid 4 or 5 times, and it wouldn't budge. All the while, I was staring at them, frozen in fear, and trying to comprehend the situation. I snapped out of it and slammed the bars over the window, locking them and running upstairs to the storage room, where I pushed a table up against the door and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bars of the windows being shaken aggressively. When they realized they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, angry scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood. By the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who it was, but were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't too keen on staying there, so shortly after I moved out. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar has happened since. This happened to me a few years ago. In January, I was at a movie theater and got my backpack stolen. It had a spare key to my apartment in it. It also had an old credit card statement with my address. Fast forward to September, and I wanted to watch the movie Joker, but I'm stuck at work on a Friday night and it's too late to watch it. So I reluctantly went home and it was around 10 p.m., and I'm watching Dateline NBC about someone being murdered. I'm not really paying attention to it, but I hear someone walking outside, closer towards my apartment, and they're dragging something heavy. Then I hear the storm door open, so I'm confused, but I assumed it must have been my landlord. But I didn't understand what he would want at 10 p.m. I expected a knock at the door, but I didn't hear a knock. Instead, I heard a key insert into the lock and the doorknob turn. Fortunately, I had my landlord replace the key 2 days after my backpack was stolen. The key obviously didn't work, and I heard them quickly run away after they discovered it was the wrong key. I was hiking across Newfoundland, following an old railway that was long ago disassembled and turned into a giant trail. and sleeping wherever I found myself at night. One day, I ran into a small cottage town, except everything was abandoned. It was creepy, but interesting at the same time. The sun was waning, so I decided to set up camp in a mostly empty lot that had an abandoned truck slowly falling into a ravine near it. I cooked up some food and crawled into my tent to sleep. I woke up sometime in the night and I heard footsteps outside my tent. At first I thought it was an animal, but the steps sounded more like a human walking. The steps got closer and went around my tent. I slowly and quietly pull out my knife, and if he tries to get in, my plan is to stab first and ask questions later. Anyone trying to get into my tent at night in the middle of nowhere is looking to do some kind of harm. My heart was racing at this point, but I tried to stay quiet. Luckily, the steps started moving away from the tent until I couldn't hear them anymore. I waited a bit to see if they'll come back, but I didn't hear anything. I slowly got out of my tent, and I didn't see anything. Without turning on my flashlight, I quickly took everything down and stuffed it into my bag. After that, I started walking down the trail to get the hell out of there. I walked until daytime and came across a road and flagged down a truck. The guy was nice and drove me into town where I got a hotel. The creepy thing, when I think back to it, was whoever that was likely watched me walk into town from one of the abandoned structures. I'd like to say that I think he was just curious, but I'm glad I didn't stay and wait to see if he'd come back. My uncle used to work on board the Great Lakes freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, and they would haul iron ore and limestone across the Great Lakes. One day, at around 7 p.m. in November 2007, they were crossing Lake Superior on their way to Cleveland, Ohio, when they started receiving distress calls on the radio from an unknown vessel claiming to be the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald famously sank in 1975, taking all 29 crewmen with it. He said at first they all thought it was some kind of distasteful prank, until they checked the radar, and they found that there were no other ships around for at least 70 nautical miles. And the range of the radios are only 60 nautical miles. He said that the voice that they had heard on the radio described a heavy storm and high winds, and they were having a hard time holding their own. My uncle said you could hear true fear in the man's voice over the radio. But the thing was, there was no storm at all. In fact, the water was calm and the night was clear. At around 8 p.m., my uncle said that the distress calls on the radio came to an abrupt stop, leaving the whole room in a terrifying silence. And the radio stayed quiet for the rest of the night. Nobody was able to sleep that night, haunted by what they had just witnessed. When it comes down to it, there is a sense of irony in this event, being as not only is the ship my uncle was on, the SS Arthur M. Anderson was the sister ship to the Edmund Fitzgerald, but it was also the last ship to make contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975 when it sank. Could my uncle and his shipmates have actually made contact with the ghosts of the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald, or could there be another explanation to this event? We'll never know, but it made one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. At the end of the street that I live on was a beautiful mansion that has been abandoned for 30 years. Chilling near the lake, a couple friends and I had decided we wanted to go explore it because of how long it had been abandoned. I'm an 18-year-old male with all female friends, and we decided to first sit by the water and have a couple cigarettes. After about 5 minutes, we heard a blood-curdling scream coming from a child. As we had a look around, we found that no one else was there. We got scared, so we decided to go inside of the house through a broken garage door because everything had been boarded up. The minute you walk into the garage, you see a door which goes down the hallway to the main room, as well as a set of stairs that goes upstairs to the bedrooms. I wanted to take a look at the main room, and my friends went upstairs, which is not a problem because I can handle myself if I encounter someone crazy and human. After about 10 minutes, I found the basement, which had its own little movie theater. In the corner, what I thought would have been a broom closet was in fact a child's bedroom with a padlock on the door. So in the pitch black, I decided to use my flashlight to look around. I had found a picture of a burning man beside a rock with engravings on it. I had left a peace offering and left the room. I sat in the movie chairs for a second, and not even 2 minutes later, I felt choking and really cold hands around my neck. Considering nothing was there, it felt so real. I heard a man tell something to let go of me and told me to run away and get my friends and go. According to this masculine figure that I saw and heard, we were not safe there. And then I heard my friends scream, and I ran upstairs knowing where they were. There was blood dripping from the walls, and it wasn't just me who saw it. This woman had come out of a fireplace in a partially burnt outfit, I would say a 1960s dress. There was open burn wounds on her hands and neck. I grabbed my few friends and we left and sat outside and recouped, but before we had left, my back was burning and my best friend said her leg was feeling wet. We had lifted up my shirt and I had 3 scratch marks down my back, and we rolled up my friend's pant leg and she had a huge gash on her leg as well as 3 claw marks on her arm. To this day, we don't know what happened there, and we have not gone back to find out. In my mid-20s, I worked at a subacute rehab facility. Generally, these places exist to help those who are struggling after an accident or surgery to regain their mobility and quality of life with the help of physical therapy and around-the-clock nursing care. I worked in the dementia unit. These patients were long-term and mostly ended up living the rest of their days here. Although it was called the dementia unit, our patients were those suffering from permanent or long-term brain-related conditions. These included dementia, Alzheimer's, comas, strokes, or other traumatic brain injuries and brain tumors. These are just some of the experiences I had while working there. The first was a disembodied hand. I had just clocked in for the evening and received a report from the day shift nurse. I was standing at the end of the hallway with my back against the wall, reviewing the notes I had taken from the previous nurse. Whilst reading over my slip of paper, I felt what only could have been described as a hand dragging its fingers horizontally across my abdomen. I jerked back and looked around, but I was completely alone. Next was a call light symphony. Although I don't have a particular story about call lights, it was a normal occurrence to have call lights in empty rooms triggered, even in rooms where the wires that were attached to the call button were unplugged from the wall. Some nights, nurses would be forced to respond to several phantom calls from empty rooms. The third is the empty room ghost. At the very end of one of our halls contained a habitually empty room. The heat and air conditioning unit was broken, so patients were never placed there. The nurses and aides would use that call for privacy during personal phone calls. One evening, I headed into that room's bathroom to touch up my makeup and fix my hair. I left the bathroom door slightly ajar while going about my business. I was putting my hair up in a bun when the bathroom door slammed shut behind me. Mid-heart attack, I spun around and jerked the door back open. The room was empty. The time it would have taken a human to exit the room would have been longer than it took me to open the bathroom door again. I'd also like to note that there was no furniture in the room and nothing human could have hid behind it. I'm convinced it wasn't a living person who slammed that door. Fourth is the last farewell. One patient we had residing in the long-term unit was a middle-aged woman with severe Down syndrome. She was mostly nonverbal, saving a few words that she would utter at random. She was very sweet and always had a smile on her face. It was my turn to help her eat dinner the night the story takes place. She didn't have the motor skills to eat properly, so I spoon-fed her while we caught up on cartoons on her TV set. But this particular night, she acted completely out of character. I didn't notice at first because I was engrossed in the show we were watching together. I failed to notice her attempts to get my attention, and she resorted to using grunts to call me away from the TV screen. When I did finally notice, she was overjoyed with something. Her mouth was stretched into a wide grin, and she was pointing at an empty corner in the back of the room. I could clearly see the corner, but nothing else. I looked back and forth between her and the corner, and I couldn't understand what she was trying to communicate. She was pointing, giggling, and waving at apparently nothing in the corner. I tried asking her what she was trying to show me, simple yes or no questions, since she could answer by nodding or shaking her head. I became a bit uneasy with her actions because I knew she was seeing something I couldn't. After I finished feeding her, I walked back out into the hallway and was immediately approached by a fellow nurse. My stomach sank while she told me the next-door neighbor of the woman I was just feeding had passed away during the dinner time. The fifth and final one was the window watcher. It's not my story, but it was told to me by a fellow nurse. My friend, let's call her Mary, worked the night shift at the same rehab as I, but this story takes place years before I was hired there. Mary was close to one of her patients, and she went out of her way to make her feel special. The patient was an elderly woman with no living family and was chronically lonely. Let's call the patient Emily. When Mary bonded with Emily, it became a habit of Emily's to wait by her room's window, which faced the employee's parking lot, so when she saw Mary walking up to the building, she would wave. This became a special occasion for Emily, and the two would wave to one another before and after Mary's shift while she traveled to and from the employee's parking lot. Then Emily fell ill and was unable to get out of bed for a while. Every time Mary pulled up for work, she would check to see if Emily was waiting by the window. When she didn't see her, she would know walking in that Emily was still sick. This went on for weeks. Mary would pull into the parking lot hoping to see her sweet patient up and out of bed waiting for her to wave. But then one day Mary showed up for work and saw Emily standing at her window, peering out and over the employee parking lot. Mary was thrilled and hopped out of her car and gave Emily a gleeful wave. But Emily stood motionless and did not react to Mary's greeting. Puzzled, Mary headed into the building and found out Emily had passed away earlier that day. So every summer in my city, me and my friends like to make small campfires in chill, secluded areas because we don't want to drive an hour to an actual campsite, and pay any campsite fees to do so. These also happen pretty spontaneously, so it's a nice last-minute hang to do. There's this one spot near my house that's located by a river that's really nice because no one usually goes there. The only thing to be worried about are bears because living in the Pacific Northwest is challenging. And my house specifically is located right next to mountains and forest. So one particular night at 11 p.m., I decided to go ahead of my friends and meet them at a spot and set things up early, because I wanted to be chilling once they all got there. The spot I get to has a 2-minute paved walkway I have to go through, and then I have to take a small trail ramping down the right side of the bridge that crosses over the river. Along this paved walkway are 2 lamps, located halfway and another at the start of the bridge/ramp down to the campfire spot. I park my car at the beginning of the trail on the street and bring my campfire stuff, like flashlight, lighter, small firewood, small shovel to dig out the pit, and other things. I get to the spot, and it's a small sandy beach kind of embankment on the side of the river, with a small waiting area for toddlers with their families during the hot summers. So I set up the chair and I get digging to the pit with only my flashlight illuminating where I'm digging. I'm also just shoveling the sand right next to me. I'm nowhere near the water, but all of a sudden I heard a loud splash. A splash so loud that it could only have come from something equally large like a 2-hand-sized rock. I'm confused because I swear I'm not throwing my sand into the water, even though I'm only a few feet away. I shine my flashlight at the water and I don't see anything. So I kind of just brush it off, thinking I'm just hearing things. But as I keep shoveling a bit more, I heard another loud splash. At this point, I think it's something falling from above, because logically something must be falling into the water. I point the flashlight above where some trees are above the river, and I don't see anything big enough to make the splash. So as I kept digging, my heart rate was kind of going up at this point. I hear a rustling past the arc where the bridge goes over the river. I quickly grab my light and shine towards where I heard the rustling. I called out a hello, but no response. In my head, if it was a bear, I should be getting out of there immediately, but there was no bear or any signs of that matter. So I tell myself I'm just hearing things now, because I've seen horror movies before and now my mind is playing tricks on me. But I hear the noise again, and it clearly sounds like leaves rustled, so I shine my flashlight over the area again, and as I focus my eyes towards the illuminated area, I see the naked back of a man hunched over. I was kind of frozen in anxiety and stress, because honestly of all things I was to see, I didn't think I'd see the naked back of a man. From the quick analysis my brain could muster up, he looked to be mid-40s, shaved but not bald, and medium-ish build, like a mix between chubby and built. As I had my flashlight staying on his back, he started to stand up, and the first thing I noticed was that he wasn't wearing any pants either. My next reflex was to pack up all my crap and get the hell out of there, because I'm piecing in my head that he must have been the one throwing things in the water to scare or shoo me away. So after using my reflexive deductive skills, I proceeded to speed walk out of there with all my stuff. I'm carrying all my things with me and briskly walk up the small ramp, and I'm on the paved path now out of the forest. I can feel my heart beating in my chest, and I'm frequently looking back to make sure I'm not being followed. I'm in Crocs, mind you, so I'm hoping that if I have to book it out of there, I'd regret not being in sport mode from the get-go. I made it to the halfway point, and a sense of relief started setting in, knowing I made it safely out of that very scary situation. But as I checked behind me for the final time, I saw something. Slowly creeping over the ramp is the naked man, crawling on all fours as if he was a primate walking. His head was positioned towards me, looking at me as if he made his way to the middle of the paved walkway. He slowly got up from his stance and started standing on his feet. After setting himself into his new position, the man started running towards me. I freaking booked it. I ran as hard as I could down the path. My flashlight jumped out of my pocket, and I lost it, but I didn't care. A whole naked-ass man was chasing me at 11 at night in a secluded forest. I looked back for a split second, and the man was still running towards me, still completely naked. He could have my flashlight for all I care. I want to make it out of this alive. I finally made it out, and I ran to my car, which is only 30 feet away from the end of the forest. I desperately get into my car like a classic horror movie. I fumbled my keys, trying to get my key fob to unlock the car. I actually dropped my keys and quickly thought to myself, I'm actually dead. But I brushed off the thought and picked them back up. I get my fob in properly, unlock my doors, and throw my things into my back seat before getting into my car. This felt like an eternity, but in hindsight, this all took like 6 seconds altogether. As I tried to guide my key into the ignition, I'm fixated at the end of the paved path that I was just on a few seconds ago, waiting to see if the naked man was coming still. I feel my key go into the ignition, and I switch my sights onto the road in front of me, and I zoomed out of the area as fast as possible. After I drove away and was a good 30 seconds from the location of the horror that just took place, I got a call on my phone. It was my friends calling and asking if I made it to the spot yet, and all I had to say to them was, "Guys, do I have a story to tell you?" I'm an 18-year-old female, and have been working for a large department store in the UK for just over a year now. The story happened when I was 16. It was a late evening, around 9 p.m. or so, and we stayed open late for the Christmas rush. I was walking across the shop floor when a man brushed very close to me. I'm often in my own world at work, and this man made me jump a little. He must have noticed this because he said hello, and I responded, and he asked me how I was. I said good, and you? He nodded and walked towards the doors out into the car park. I didn't think much of this at all, but it did catch me off guard. I decided to walk to the other side of the shop. Bear in mind the floor plan is massive, and continued tidying rails there. I hear a man shout from a few meters away, and I looked up to see it was the same guy again. It's only now that I really took notice of his appearance. He had a large tattoo of a dagger on his right cheekbone, and was wearing a black jumper with his hood pulled over. He was about a foot taller than me, and clearly much older. I asked him if he needed any help, and he gestured for me to come closer to him. I tend to freeze and follow instructions in this situation, which is not exactly the best survival instinct. I naively thought that he just wanted to know which exit he needed. He asked me what my name was, and I told him. "You've got really pretty eyes," he said. At this point, I was getting a bit freaked out. I thanked him hesitantly and turned to leave, but he put his hand on my forearm. Again, I kinda just froze. "Have you got a boyfriend? Have you got Snapchat? Can I get your number?" He became more and more persistent, and I just wanted him to leave. I told him that number 1, I was working, and number 2, I'm underage. He then asked me how old I was, and I told him I was 16. Again, I don't know why I answered him, but my brain just shuts down. To which he responded, "It could work." I was really shaken up and didn't know what to do. Thankfully, one of my male colleagues walked up to me to ask a question, making this guy leave. He winked at me as he did so. Noticing my distress, he asked me what had happened, and I explained the situation. He urged me to report it, but I was hesitant as I didn't want to inconvenience anyone or get them into trouble. However, there are a lot of teenage girls that work in that shop, and I wouldn't want any of them to be targeted, so I told one of the managers. Management notified the store security and sent me off to the shop floor to get some coffee and calm down. I came back, finished my shift, and went to leave. The security guy stopped me on my way out and told me that he didn't mean to alarm me, but they had managed to track this man's car and he was parked inside of it. They said that there was a high probability that he was waiting for me, and that I shouldn't go there by myself, just as a precaution. He escorted me to my mom's car and we drove home. I'm so thankful that nothing ended up happening to me that night. I often think about what would have happened if my friend didn't persuade me to report it, and if I just went out there alone. This happened when I was 17. I was walking home from a party and it was pretty late, around 4:35 a.m. One of my guy friends had decided to walk me home since he didn't want me walking alone so late. The streets were empty and it was pitch black. As we were walking and chatting, we noticed that this man is walking up to us. When he approaches us, he started saying over and over, "Hey, I'm a good guy, I promise." He didn't seem threatening, and I remember that I didn't feel scared. And maybe because I was with my friend, who was an athletic person. So now this guy started to ask us for money to buy a sandwich. He tells us that he can't return home until 10 a.m. because his neighbor has a restraining order against him, and apparently the neighbor leaves for work at that hour. At that point, we were wondering what the hell was going on. But we decided to give him some money so he would leave us alone. We gave him around €5, which is more than enough to buy a sandwich. We then lied and told him that's all we had. Then the man looks at me and goes, "No, that's not true. You have more money in your wallet. I can see it from here." At that point, I just put my wallet back into my purse and told him I couldn't give him any more money. As we were walking away, this man once again catches up to us and goes, "Why don't you guys come with me and try and find a vending machine? And that way you can make sure I'm not spending your money on drugs." I don't exactly remember what we told him, but there was no way we were going with him anywhere. Even though I didn't feel scared or threatened at the moment, in hindsight, it was kind of creepy, and I'm glad my friend insisted on walking me home. Was this guy desperate for money, or did he have other intentions? I went to take some nighttime photos of a local historic building which was condemned, but had been used to house scientists in the 1940s. I went there with 3 of my friends around midnight. It was a run-down 2-story U-shaped building with a 3rd floor that only covered small parts of the building. It also had a run-down pool that had a busted-up fence still around it. 2 of my friends went around the right side of the building, and I went around to the left with my other friend. As we came around the very back side of the building, we noticed that there was a window that did not have its curtains closed. We looked in, and on the left side of the room was a desk covered in massive amounts of dust, with an exception of a singular handprint on the desk. The chair to the desk was also half cocked to the side, as though somebody had been recently sitting there. On the right side of the room was a bed that was made up with an ugly green comforter, neatly tucked down with 2 white pillows. The bed was completely tucked and neat, and it was like a fake bed in a model Barbie house. To the back left was a door which was boarded up from the outside rather extensively. We thought it was weird, but figured that maybe somebody had snuck inside. We tried to take pictures, but both of our cameras were dead. We started heading back around to the front of the building, expecting to get our phones out of the car. We get back from the front side of the building and meet my 2 other friends there. Wondering why we were there, we explained what happened and that our cameras were dead. As we were explaining it, though, we heard glass shatter towards the side of the building where the room was. We looked up, and there was a broken window up on the 3rd floor's attic room. We thought there might be a homeless person in there, and we made our way back to the front of the building, and as we come around the corner, there was a police officer waiting there. Apparently there's an agreement with the people who live up the hill from this building that they would watch over it and call the police in case anything suspicious happened. Explaining that I was just there to take photos, the officer seemed irritated to have to respond to the call. He didn't seem comfortable being there, as though he may have already had some run-ins with the place. I apologized to the officer because I didn't know I wasn't allowed to take pictures of the local landmark. Then I explained that he might want to check for homeless people or drug users inside. And when he asked why, I explained the glass breaking. He asked us to show him where it was, and we took him over to the side of the building. When we were walking, not only was the glass no longer broken, the curtain was now closed, and it smelled like rotten eggs really bad. To this day, I don't know what the hell that was. I never believed in ghosts before, and I'm not really a spiritual person or anything, but I can't explain it. When I was 11, we moved into a haunted house. From the beginning, we knew something was off. The house was big, probably built in the 40s, and had hardwood floors. There were axe marks in the wood floors of the living room. I would have nightmares, almost nightly, of a man standing outside my window. His face was disfigured by burns. Although he never tried to get in my dreams, it was enough to terrify 11-year-old me. Our family would be sitting in the living room, and we would hear someone walking in the hallway. You could track their progress from one end of the hallway to the other, eventually going into the den and disappearing. We would hear someone in the kitchen, moving pots and pans around or whispering. I had shoes with hard soles, they were loafer style, and my family would constantly yell at me for walking in the hallway with those loud-soled shoes, but it wasn't me. They'd come out and I would be sitting on the couch or sleeping. My brother was a baby, and we had one of those wind-up style baby swings for him. And once he fell asleep in the swing, you never wanted to rewind it because it would make such a god-awful noise. But you could sit in the living room with my brother asleep and the swing would be stopped, and you would just start watching it swing on its own. And there were always more instances. Rocking chairs that rocked by themselves, the hot water in the shower would turn on by itself. After I grew up, my kids and I stayed there briefly with my parents, and my children would have the same nightmares about the burnt person outside the window. About 6 years ago, a gentleman stopped by the house and had a long conversation with my stepmother. He told her that he grew up in the house in the 60s, and that his dad had mental issues and alcoholism. At the end of it, he tried to set his wife and kids on fire, but ended up burning himself in the process. This encounter happened to me in 2010, when I lived in Chicago. I went with my best bud to catch a science fiction movie at AMC River East, my favorite theater in town. We sat in the balcony in the cavernous theater number 2. No one was on the balcony with us. I gave my bud some money to get popcorn and soda. As I sat there watching those annoying pre-movie commercials, I heard the chair behind me squeak. It sounded like someone sat down right behind me, but you'd have to enter from the side of me, so pretty much I'd be able to see you walk in. I didn't think about it too much until I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked at it like, why is this person touching me? I saw red nails and a big wedding ring and a pearl bracelet. I heard a woman's voice say, "Pick up the phone when it rings. It's your mother. Do as she asks." I didn't really recognize the voice because it was more of a whisper. Then I felt a gentle stroking of my hair, and I could smell a floral perfume. At that point, my buddy had returned. He looked at me and asked who that lady was behind me, but he couldn't describe her well because of the shadows. The theater lights started to dim and the trailer started. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was my mother. My grandmother had just died unexpectedly, and I needed to go home and help her with funeral arrangements. She thought I was the only one who'd be able to keep it together and organize it. At the funeral, my grandmother's hands were crossed like you'd expect. She had shiny red nails, her wedding ring, and a pearl bracelet. I could smell her rose perfume as well. It was the last thing my grandfather bought her before he passed too. I used to work at one of the most haunted places in Ontario, Fort George National Historic Site. I was never really a believer because plenty of times I've been working there at night and nothing odd ever happened. My last season working there, I stayed on until the winter. I'm sitting in the blockhouse, Soldiers Barracks, 15 minutes into opening. I'm by myself and it's a slow, rainy October day, about midweek. Above me, I heard footsteps loud and prominent. Nothing out of the ordinary. We have stuff upstairs for occasional field trip programs. It is off limits, but usually often enough, curious people take a look. So I go to the base of the steps to shoo off the visitors, and it's pitch dark up there. I called up. "Sir, ma'am, that area is off limits right now. If you come down here, I'd love to give a tour of the barracks for you." I get no answer. A bit more shaky, I called back again, but still no answer. I take a few steps up the stairway, just enough to see up there, and I saw nothing. No light, no people, nothing, and I was shook. I leave the blockhouse and sit outside for the next hour. Nobody comes out, and there are only 2 doors to the building, so I would have seen someone leave. I asked my coworkers if anyone was playing a joke on me. They said no, and they were all older people, so why would they anyway? I also learned that there was no visitors in the fort yet. Turns out after asking around, I'm not the first one to experience this. There is a known ghost that does that on rare occasions. Nobody has seen them, but it has been reported before. I was a skeptic before this, but nothing logical would have made those footsteps. This happened to me when I was 13. For some background, I had switched to another school that was further away from home. And now instead of only taking one bus, I had to take a bus, a train, and then another bus to get there. With my now longer commute, I had to leave my house around 7 a.m. if I wanted to be there for 8:30. For the most part, I had never worried about safety since public transit was pretty busy in the morning. As I got off the train, I had to cross a big bridge in order to reach the area with the different bus routes. There were 3 major ones, but it didn't matter which one I got on, as they all passed the school before breaking off into separate directions. So one morning, as I was waiting for one of the buses to show up, some random construction worker, also waiting for the bus, started talking to me. He looked around mid-30s. I didn't think much of it, as I was easy to have a conversation with. I started seeing him more frequently at the bus area, and I began to find it a bit strange because he would always compliment me. He'd say I had a cool bag or a nice jacket at first, but he never said anything that would raise any red flags. Things started to get weird pretty quick, and he would start complimenting my features, saying I had pretty eyes or a cute smile. I was beginning to get a bit uncomfortable, but again, I just brushed it off and chose to start avoiding him. I never thought too much of my own safety, as there were people around and I had a cell phone in case I had to call my parents or the police. I didn't see the guy for a few days, so I began to think I was in the clear and forgot about him. But then things really began to escalate. I was sitting by myself with my earbuds in when suddenly someone tapped my shoulder and sat beside me. It was the guy, and he was now talking to me like we were friends. I was really uncomfortable and tried to dismiss him and went to walk away to the other side of the bus area. But that's when what he said really caught me off guard. He just casually turns to me like it was nothing and says, "What would you do if I tied you up and never let you go?" I was genuinely appalled. I got up from the bench and started walking away. He got up and started to follow me when 2 buses pulled up, thankfully. He of course followed me onto the bus, and who knows, it could have been coincidence on where he was going. But I wasn't having it in case, so I hopped off and went on to the second one. If he followed me on again, I was going to tell the bus driver I needed help. But luckily, the guy didn't. I was so damn confused. I went to school and the first thing I did was tell my friends what happened. I really did not understand the severity of this situation at first, because I was a 13-year-old male and I didn't think these things happened to guys. As I was telling the story, I was kind of downplaying it because nothing bad actually happened, and there were no real repercussions. Everyone gave me a dumbfounded stare as no one knew what to say. Then, one of the teachers overheard me, which I'm not surprised, I was a loud kid, and in a look of shock, brought me to the principal's office. I missed the entire first period of the day explaining what happened to the principal and a police officer. My parents at first were really confused on why I didn't mention anything of the weird guy before. Honestly, I didn't think about it. I was driven to school the next few days until a police officer came over to talk to me and my parents. He said that they found the guy on the transit cameras and were able to track him down and talk to him. There wasn't too much the officer could do aside from telling the guy to stay away from me, and that what he said was not appropriate since he technically didn't do anything illegal. The officer did tell me that they would be monitoring the train station around that time, and if that guy ever approaches me or talks to me, to call 911. I saw him like 2 or 3 more times after, and he never spoke to me or even looked at me, which I'm very thankful for. I've always wondered what would have happened if that teacher didn't overhear me, or if I just didn't tell anyone, but I am glad nothing major or lasting came from it. But this did really open my eyes a lot about being more aware in public. I used to live in a small neighborhood from ages 13 to 18. This took place when I was around 15. I spent most of my time just walking around the neighborhood listening to my MP3 player. There was a guy around the same age as me that lived maybe 5 or so houses down. From neighborhood gossip, I learned that he was homeschooled and had been in and out of juvie due to his anger issues. He was almost always outside, and sometimes when I passed his house, he would start following me. I was smart enough to always have my music down, low enough to be able to hear and be aware of my surroundings. At first, I just passed it off as he ended up walking the same time of day I did. Looking back, I was truly dumb. As time passed, he got closer and closer to me when following, until eventually decided to come up right behind me. He said something truly heinous, things that I will not repeat here. I mean, he was right in my ear when he was talking. I ran home and told my sister, who basically raised me. She told me I was lying and to stop making up stories. For a while I stopped going out walking, until I needed the fresh air and exercise, and tried again after maybe 2 months. Sure enough, there he was, and came up right behind me and started to say things again. I turned my music up and ignored him. This is what I continued to do every day, until he got tired of me ignoring him, I guess. Because one day, he grabbed my arm. I couldn't get away, and then he grabbed the back of my neck and told me that I should know better than to ignore him. Again, I told my sister. She didn't believe me, and I stopped going out again. 2 weeks later, I woke up to loud bangs on my bedroom wall. There was a garage on both sides of the house, and the wall of my bedroom shared a wall with one of the garages. This garage was unfinished, and there wasn't even concrete down. It was easily accessible from the outside, as it was missing the door at the back of the house. My sister was out of town, and my dad was deaf and bedridden, so it was just me in the house able to do anything. My bedroom also had a door to go outside, so I ran over and locked it. I laid down and waited for the banging to stop, but it didn't. My cousin and her boyfriend lived down the street, so I called her, and she sent her boyfriend down to see what it was. Her boyfriend pulled right up to the backyard and right up to the door into the garage. His headlights filled the garage and outran the guy from down the street, holding a large knife. He took off running, and my cousin's boyfriend followed. It was at this time I called the police. They came and took a statement, but they said there was nothing they could do because, other than going into the garage and trespassing, he didn't actually do anything. I never took a walk in that neighborhood again. I still wonder how he knew what wall to bang on. How did he know I was on the other side of it? How did he know my sister was gone, or that my dad was bedridden and couldn't do anything? I never locked the door, so had he been in my house to know? What would have happened if I had gone outside? It still gives me the creeps. I used to be a 911 dispatcher for a small city. We dispatched all law, fire, EMS, for the entire county, and within this county, there were multiple law agencies. I had been there for about 3 months or so when I met him. Let's call him Jake. Jake had recently transferred from a big department in California and landed himself randomly at our department. It didn't make much sense on why he left California in the first place, but he always insisted it was just time for him to move to a smaller and less dangerous department. Him and I quickly became close and would chat almost every day after I got off shift. Within a few months, it became apparent that we liked each other, and our flirting progressed into something a little more serious. Fast forward to a few months later, and it turns out he was doing some inappropriate things and took photos and videos of me whilst he was active on duty. This and a few other things he had kept hidden on duty led to him losing his license and leaving. During the process of his termination, his sergeant had suggested I get a protective order against him, as he had made some threatening statements previously towards me. I had began to fill out the paperwork and was told I had a temporary protective order on him in the meantime, but I don't think I ever did. About 2 weeks after his termination, he called me to catch up. The entire call was like an old friend to an old friend. What am I doing for work? Do I have a boyfriend now? But progressively became more personal. When does my shift end? What do you drive? Being 18 and naive, I treated him like I always had and was answering his questions. I had contacted his old department afterwards, as a sergeant told me to let him know if I was ever contacted again. But they turned me away pretty quickly and didn't want anything to do with it. With that, I blocked Jake. Roughly a month later, I get a call from a new number and it's Jake. Once again, he wants to meet up and catch up. But this time, he so casually goes on to tell me about this new house he was wanting to buy in my neighborhood, knowing it was my neighborhood. I'd never told him where I lived in town, let alone what specific neighborhood. During this call, he progressively got more aggressive as well. making statements such as, "If you knew I was going to get canned, I should have just had my way with you." He half-heartedly joked about getting a hotel room just for me, and that was that. A few days later, he FaceTimed me, and once again came off as simply as wanting to catch up with me as he was sick. Midway through our seemingly normal conversation, he makes it apparent that he was touching himself the whole time. Keep in mind, nothing suggestive was mentioned, and our conversation at that point was about his new dog. He's blocked once again, but has tried to follow me on social media, and now I've started to see him in my area. Last I knew, he lived roughly 30 to 45 minutes in the opposite direction from me. So this started about 2 to 3 years back. I just had a terrible breakup, and I started receiving these disturbing phone calls. It started simple. The first call I answered, and the person on the other end said how much they missed me. Now, I have a very small circle of friends, and I'm not on Facebook or any social sites where I update my photos or daily activities. This is important, and I know the ex I just split up with had nothing to do with the following. The first call, like I said, was simple. They said they missed me. I asked who it was, and they just said, "It's me. Don't you remember?" So I hung up, and they immediately called back, crying, upset, and saying that I was being mean. The caller was clearly an adult male, but they were talking as if though they were a very young child, around 6. I hung up again, and they didn't call back. Looking back, I should have just blocked the number, and as I mentioned, I just got blindsided by a breakup and wasn't thinking very well. Then they kept calling. They would call, and if I didn't answer, they left messages, saying how pretty I looked with my blue sweater that day, or that they knew how I took my coffee and said they would remember it for when we finally went out for a drink together. I blocked the numbers. They would call from another. I answered one day, yelling at them to leave me alone, and hung up again. When they called back, it wasn't the boy, but his mother. She was very upset, said I was hurting her boy by not wanting to play, and you could very clearly hear the boy crying and screaming in the background. At this point, it dawned on me that this wasn't a joke, prank, or something. There was something seriously wrong with these people, and they were obviously watching me. I haven't heard from the people for a year now, but I checked my phone after a very busy workday and noticed 10 missed calls, and I'm honestly terrified to check my voicemail. I've reached out to the cops, but they won't do anything since I haven't been explicitly threatened, and have been advised to just block calls. I'm going to change my number, but I'm terrified that the calls will continue, even after that, and that it will upset them further. When I was 11, my parents were at a tournament with my 13-year-old brother for the day, and I begged my parents to let me walk to school on my own. I would usually walk with my brother, or a parent would drive me. The reason my parents didn't like me walking alone was because I had to walk through a thin but decently long alley to get to school, and they thought that since the sun wouldn't fully be up yet, it wasn't fully safe. When my parents agreed to let me walk to school alone, they told me to make sure I don't listen to music because I should be able to hear who is behind me and be aware of my surroundings. As I left the house, I turned on my MP3 player and started my walk. When I approached the alley, which was at the end of the walk as the school was on the other side, I turned off my MP3 player to make sure I could hear around me. I saw a man walking from the other side of the street towards the alley, so I kept looking back as I got to the alley to see if he was behind me. And he was. I started speed walking, and so did he. I remember him trying to say something to me, but the drop in my stomach and fear took over, and I didn't hear anything. He then was trying to catch up to me, and I remember him reaching his arms out towards my shoulders or backpack, so I sprinted to school. The custodian was outside and saw me, so I yelled for help. He brought me into the school, and I told them what happened. They called the police to take statements because the custodian saw the guy too. Fast forward to a week later, and the police came to our house to ask us if we saw a strange man watching the kids during recess beside our house. We lived behind another school, as our backyard led to the schoolyard, and beside our house, there was a little path leading to the school's field. Turns out that the guy matched the description I gave from the other week. Teachers scared him away after noticing he was trying to lure kids during recess. I was terrified for months, and never walked alone until high school. We never heard anything again. My parents talked about it for years, but it also terrified my brothers. I'd been living in a murder house for around 4 months with no issues, apart from me and my best friend Joe constantly pranking each other. Me and Joe were still working as station supervisors on the London Underground. We were great friends. We both 100% mutually friend-zoned each other from the start, and we both share love of pranks. Sure, they got a little out of hand sometimes, but it kept us both on our toes. At 26, Joe was almost 7 years older than me, and the only issue I had was that he would take my stuff sometimes. For instance, if I bought a pizza and put it in the fridge for when I got home from work, I'd come home, open the fridge, and see a note saying, "Leica, I took the pizza. Here's 20 pounds to buy another one." And there would be 20 pounds paper-clipped to the note that he had written in the fridge. He did it with everything, mostly when he had a few beers. He once drank a quarter bottle of brandy I'd been saving, and I was so mad I punched him right in the arm as hard as I could. Joe had just laughed, and he had the kind of laugh that made me laugh too. Both of us never really took anything seriously for more than a minute. The next day, I bought brandy, and I put the bottle in a drawer under my bed so we couldn't get it. I'd gone to bed and was sleeping when suddenly I was woken up by my bed moving. Joe was in my room, a little drunk, and he carefully, well, as carefully as a big, clumsy drunk could be, started opening the drawer to get to my brandy. He saw me open my eyes and started laughing. "Shh, just sleep," he mumbled. "I'm just here for the brandy." Somehow, I managed to restrain myself from breaking the bottle over his drunk head. I handed him the bottle with a tired, "Just effing take it and F off," and he took it from me and stumbled out of my room. The next night, I shut and locked my bedroom door while I slept. I told him never to come into my room and wake me up again like that. The next night, I shut and locked my bedroom door while I slept. I told him never to come into my room and wake me up like that. A couple of nights later, I was woken up by the sound of someone jiggling my door handle. Screw Joe, I thought. The door was locked, so we couldn't get in. I ignored him for a while, hoping he would give up, but the door handle kept squeaking and moving. I very quietly crept out of bed and put my hand on the lock. I was planning on carefully unsticking it. Then, wrenching the door open and throwing myself at unsuspecting Joe, screaming like a banshee. It would be so funny. I was silently giggling to myself, yet I remained deathly silent. It wouldn't work if he heard me unlock and open the door. I had one hand on the little lock, ready to twist it, and the other hand on the handle. I counted in my head. 3, 2, 1. And right then, I had a little thought that I was tired and didn't want to prank Joe after all. I'd go back to bed and pretend to be asleep, and eventually he would stop fiddling with my door handle. So that's what I did. I got back in my warm bed and went off to sleep. I was woken by Joe some hours later. "Leica!" he shouted, knocking on my door. "Come out of your room really carefully, and don't freak out. Don't touch anything. I've already called the police." He sounded different to how he usually sounds. I carefully unlocked my door and slowly opened it. I looked outside of my room and noticed that every knife we had in the house was on the floor, outside of my room, arranged in a small semicircle, facing my door. We both liked to cook and had 2 sets of deadly sharp chef knives and a set of steak knives. So yeah, we had a lot of knives. And right now, they were all on the landing carpet, pointing directly at my bedroom door. I asked Joe if he heard anything, and if it was him trying to get into my room around 1 a.m. He looked at me wide-eyed and told me that he hadn't even been home all night. His shift had finished at 11 p.m. and the night foreman hadn't shown up for his shift, so Joe volunteered to stay and work a double shift. He'd finished around 6 a.m. and arrived home to find a downstairs window had been forced open and a lot of things moved around. The police arrived and weren't really bothered because no one was hurt, and nothing had been taken. But tons of things around the house were moved around, and the way they were moved was in like weird shapes and patterns. I shudder when I think of what could have or would have happened if I would to have wrenched the door open thinking it was Joe. I was working for a web hosting company. My shift was 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. I lived in a rural part of Oklahoma, about 20 miles east of Oklahoma City. Most of the houses are farms, and they are separated usually by acres, if not miles, of farmland between houses. One night in September, I was driving home exhausted because I just worked overtime, and it was 3:30 in the morning. I turned down a road that I didn't normally take because I figured why not? It's the country. So as I get further away from the city, the darker and more wooded the road gets. I paid no attention as I was tired. I have my headlights on high, and I turn down a road headed toward my house. After a while, I feel like I've been driving for a really long time down this road with no intersection. But I kept going anyway. All of a sudden, I see something in the road, so I stop and look at it. It's an entire tree branch, a huge branch. Not one I could have just ran over or avoided. I wasn't even thinking logically as to why this tree branch was in the road. There hadn't been any storms or high winds. I proceeded to get out of my car and start moving this branch. Then, I hear something, so I turn the car off and listen. It's someone whistling in the woods, on land that has no house for miles. I start to get in my car quietly, and the whistling stops. I hear footsteps stomping and getting louder. I turned the car on and threw it in reverse and slammed the gas down until I got back onto the main road. I still haven't been back down that road since. This happened to me 10 years ago, but I still remember it vividly. Me and my cousin were house sitting in the middle of nowhere. It was a one-story house built higher on the ground, surrounded by mountains. The clock was nearing 4 a.m., and we were just chatting and snacking in the kitchen when we heard a sound coming from right outside one of the two windows. It was the crunching of leaves, like someone or something heavy was stepping on them slowly. At first, we thought it was a wild animal searching for food, but then things got creepier when we heard another sound coming from the other window that overlooked the metal stairs that led up to the front door of the house. It was as if someone was climbing up them. The footsteps sounded too heavy for an animal. No one was supposed to be around the perimeter, so we froze in place, thinking it could be someone dangerous. My cousin wanted to take a look, but I stopped him, thinking whoever it was could have a gun. But he didn't listen to me and looked anyway. There was no one. If someone was there and climbed down quickly, we definitely would have heard it. We were no more than 1 to 2 meters away from the window. While we were trying to make sense of the situation, the sounds picked up again. It was the crunching steps coming along the first window again. The window was above the counter, so I climbed up to take a look. My cousin did the same too. We could still hear the footsteps because it was close. And then the scariest part came. The steps got closer and closer, eventually passing right under the window. But there was nothing in sight. Nothing. It was as if someone invisible walked right by us, and our heads just followed the sound. I froze in fear again, and my cousin must have been as scared as I did because he pulled me back and closed the window. I turned my head around to ask him what the hell just happened, but when I looked at him, half of his face was covered in blood. I think it was just a coincidence that his nose started bleeding at the exact moment, but it was enough to scare us into going into a windowless room and staying awake until the sunrise. This happened in my early 20s, so about 10 years ago, and it makes my skin crawl trying to think of what might have happened to me. Around 10:30 on a summer evening, I was driving home from my boyfriend's house and stopped to grab something to eat from a fast food joint. I also ordered a hamburger patty for my dog, who was in the back seat of my car. The street I need to turn left on to go home is busy, and there is no stoplight. While I was waiting, I'm eating some of my food with my window half down, enjoying the nice weather. Then I hear someone say something to my left and see a group of 4 guys about a block away, walking to my direction down the sidewalk. Since my radio was on, I didn't hear what they said, and I stupidly turned it down and said, "What?" One of the guys in front starts saying something, but again, I miss what he's saying. I glanced back at the seat and see a wall full of traffic both ways. Unable to turn, and consider turning right instead so I could just leave. The guy speaks again, and this time I heard him. "Hey, can we get a ride?" "Oh, no," I stammered out. This isn't good. They're about 10 feet away from my car at this point, and I start rolling up my window while glancing between the guys in traffic. Still, no openings. My window was almost up as that car had power windows that were so damn slow. Maybe a couple inches left, and I decided to go back up into the parking lot and leave via an exit that led through a neighborhood. I put my car into reverse right as the guy who asked for a ride gets to my door. He was heavily leaning up against the door and asks if him and his friends could get a ride. The way he was asking wasn't right, and his friends walked up pretty close behind him. The next bit happened so fast, but felt like minutes went by. I took my foot off the brake and started reversing back into the parking lot because my brain was screaming at me to leave immediately. And rightfully so, because as I say nope and start to roll back, he tries to open my car door. I can still remember the thud sound of the handle snapping back down. Suddenly my dog, who had been previously enjoying his hamburger and oblivious to what's happening, jumped up and started throwing himself and bouncing off the window, barking and snarling. The guy at my door put his hands up and said, "Oh, I didn't know you had a dog." And he and his friends quickly backed away as I floored it backwards with my heart in my throat. I didn't know my way through the neighborhood exit well, but I kept driving and turning down streets until I figured out where I was. Once I got home and was safely in my garage with the door shut, I realized how much I was shaking. No idea what those guys wanted to do, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I'm so thankful my dog lost his shit and provided enough of a surprise and distraction for me to get out of there, and also to my mom for teaching me to always keep my car doors locked. Many years ago, I used to work the night shift at a hotel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. During the season, it wasn't so bad, mostly families and such. We had an on-site security back then too. However, in the off-season, the winter months were different. The cheap weekly rates would often attract a lot of creepy people. The idea was supposed to be to make money in the off-season by renting to what are known as snowbirds. Older retired people who came to the beach for a month or more during the winter. It did not always work out that way though. The cheaper rates made it more possible for a less than desirable element to become long-term residents. I've discovered more than my fair share of meth labs, broken up assaults, and more during the winter months. Working the third shift, I would meet some interesting people. The cold weather meant some homeless people would come in to get warm and grab a cup of free coffee. I wasn't supposed to let them, but it's not in me to be cruel. I would let them grab a cup of coffee and get warm for a minute, as long as they didn't cause any trouble. As you can see, the night shift in the winter made for some crazy and sometimes creepy stories. I have a lot, but this one stands out because it didn't end well for me. I had a great night up until this point. I went to an indie wrestling show with my best friend before work. In fact, I had agreed to come in an hour early the next night for the young lady that worked the second shift in exchange for her working an hour late for me on this night, so I could enjoy the wrestling show. Ironically enough, I met Terry Funk that night, a wrestling legend known for his hardcore and bloody matches. Little did I know, I was about to experience this kind of violence for real. I was supposed to be there at midnight due to her working over an hour for me. I normally came in at 11 p.m. I counted the register and she briefed me on her shift as usual. As she was leaving, my friend, whom we'll call Andrew, pulled up. He worked second shift maintenance at this hotel, and the other two hotels are company owned. He would regularly stop by after work and grab us some food, and we would play World of Warcraft on our laptops after eating for a while, since business was so slow. He was just getting my money, ordering food, and getting ready to leave. I was excited, telling him how much fun I had at the wrestling show and showing him my Terry Funk t-shirt I was so proud of. I was just walking into the back office to put the t-shirt up when I heard the doorbell indicating a customer had entered. I had turned around and when I heard someone say something loudly, but I still couldn't make out what they said, I had reached the doorway when I saw Andrew fall down in front of me. The next thing I know, a guy walks around the corner and punches me in the head with a short steel pipe in his hand. It staggered me, and I went to one knee. He hits me in the head with the pipe. The next thing I know, I hear the other guy, whom I didn't notice up until this moment, say he got away and got a cop. I was finally able to get onto my feet. I tried to call the police from the phone in the back office, but it was having issues. I slammed it in frustration. I was hurting and scared, really freaking out. I realized that they could come back, so I ran and locked the door. I didn't know where Andrew had gone, and that worried me. I called 911 about this time. blood had started pouring down my head. I told the operator that I had been attacked and needed an officer and an ambulance. I then called the other hotel and let the night manager, named Travis, who was over all 3 properties, know what had happened. He thought I was messing with him at first because when we got bored, we would prank call each other. I finally convinced him I was not joking. He was going to lock up and come down. The cops and ambulance pulled up, and I opened the door. It was at this time I found out that they sucker punched him and knocked him down. Andrew was able to amazingly jump over the desk and escape just as a cop was driving by, which he ran to flag down for help. I ended up going to the hospital ER, where I had to have 10 staples in my scalp, and they gave me morphine for pain. I had no way to get home after being treated, but the doctor and nurses took pity on me and paid for a cab. My plan was to go back to work because this was December and Christmas was coming. I had 3 kids and needed all the hours I could get. When I got back to the hotel, the IT guy, Ted, was there with his wife Barbara, who also worked at the front desk. She was shocked to see me. She thought I'd still be in the hospital. I thought I'd only been hit in the head once after being punched. The video, which Ted was pulling up for the police, showed a different story. After I went to one knee, the guy had hit me not once, but a total of 10 times. I kept trying to grab the pipe and get up for some reason. I don't remember that. I guess I was out on my feet. He kept punching and hitting me with the pipe till his friend told him that Andrew got away and then got the cops. The 2 of them ran out. I was given a room at the other hotel we own, and Ted and Barbara gave me a lift there, and I was in no condition to drive due to the morphine. They also gave me a paid week off to heal. They switched me over to the other hotel on the night shift for a month, just in case they were after me in particular. We never found out why they chose to attack me. The police thought it might have been a failed strong-arm robbery, due to Andrew getting away and me just not going down. It shook me up, though, not knowing. Even though I was at the other hotel, when I came back to work the night shift, I was still nervous. Every time the door chimed, I tensed up. I couldn't afford to quit, though. As I said, I had 3 kids I was supporting. They never caught the guy as far as I know. A detective stopped by about 2 months later when I was working second shift. He showed me several mugshots and asked me if any of them looked familiar. I never got a great look at them. It all happened so fast. I had seen the video, which wasn't the best quality. Even so, 2 of them looked very familiar, like them. I pointed them out, and he asked me how sure I was. I told him honestly, like 85%. He then yelled and asked me if I wanted someone to go to jail for attempted murder on 85%. I was so stunned into silence. I was the victim, and I was attacked for no reason, and he is yelling at me like it's my fault I was busy being attacked to not get a good enough look at them. I no longer work at a hotel and night shift, and I'm glad, because it's just too dangerous in this area. I'm driving home at about 9:30 p.m. My route contains a variety of areas, including some single-lane, quiet roads. Driving along one of these single-lane roads, I end up having to slow down because of a man standing in the middle of the road, facing away from my car. Now I have my full beams on at this point, and there's no way he doesn't know that I'm driving behind him. He just decides to wait until I've come to an almost complete stop before turning around. I'm of course worried about this guy, thinking maybe he needs help. He doesn't seem to be visibly intoxicated from what I can tell, and he doesn't appear to be injured or confused, so I assume he's mostly okay. After a little while of standing, he raises his arms in a, well, kind of motion. I don't know if he was expecting me to back up or hit him or what. So I decided to sound my horn and try and nudge him along a bit. I just wanted to go home. This made him flip out completely. He closes the distance to my car and starts pounding on it, yelling at me like crazy. I couldn't hear what he was saying, though. He does this for what must have only been a few seconds, but it felt way longer. And before rounding the side of my car and punching the driver's side window at full force, fortunately, it didn't crack. The second I know he's out of the way, I floor it and get the hell out of there. happy in the knowledge that he couldn't catch up to me. So yeah, that was my first creepy encounter, and hopefully my last. I hope Mr. Spooky Carpenter is okay and gets whatever help he might need. Though it's probably best to start with a doctor for his likely broken hand. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City is a beautiful place. It produces 75% of the world's cherries and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1889. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the building on hospital grounds was guarded by patrolling security guards. The psychiatric hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourism traps, cafes, etc., but many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel, which the hospital staff use to safely transport patients from building to building, in the frigid winter temperatures. I'm sure there were some instances where the patients underwent cruel treatment, or was subjected to the care of horrible doctors. But the TC Psych Hospital had a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unashamedly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, we would often break into abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for or trying to justify my criminal act of B&E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors, walls, vandalism, and strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightened youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of those stories. I'm sorry to disappoint, but I never encountered anything supernatural in all of my trips to the abandoned TC Psych Hospital. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something all too human that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m. The moonlight was dim, and most patrol guards left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used, and followed our regular paths to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the window that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others: a new, faint, and unexplainable smoky odor. Not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint, we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloodied bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devotedly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me that I immediately started mumbling prayers. Personally, I don't remember doing that, but I wouldn't be too terribly surprised though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not too sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you, there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way the guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which it wouldn't be too crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's finger grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hands didn't have a solid hold on me, because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running. Obviously, we didn't. We heard the footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather been caught by guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot. Whether the cause was fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of both. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know this horrifying experience will keep us cemented into each other's memories until the day we die. This started about 6 months ago. I was getting ready for bed in my room. It was maybe 10:30 p.m. My curtains were closed, so I couldn't see out the window. But I heard 3 hard knocks on the glass of my window. Of course, that scared the life out of me, so I didn't even look and ran to go get my dad. I made him look. I live with my parents and my 2 brothers in a fairly busy neighborhood, so noises weren't uncommon here. But this knock was directly on my window, so someone wanted me to hear it. The thing was, my bedroom isn't facing the front of the house, or the road, or anything. My room is actually towards the back of the house, so someone would have had to walk into the backyard in order to knock on my window, which seemed very odd. When I had my dad check, he opened the curtains, but no one was outside the window. He even went into the backyard to check, but no one was there. That was the first incident. I closed my curtains and brushed it off as me hearing things, or some sort of animal. The following night, at almost the exact same time, I heard another 3 knocks on my window. Immediately, I went and got my dad again, for him to just see nothing all over again. This time, I did not brush it off, and I slept in my parents' room on the floor. The next few nights, there was nothing. Until about a week later. I was home alone, and it was around 8:39 p.m. I was on FaceTime with my friend, and that's when I heard 3 knocks on my window. This time I was home alone, so I couldn't go get my dad. I ran into their room and called them. They told me to call the neighbors and ask them to check since they were out of town, and I did. The neighbors saw nothing. The night after, it was around 1 a.m., I think, and I heard the knocking again. It wasn't 3 times, though. It was more. It woke me up out of a dead sleep. I was tempted to just go look out the window to see who it was, but part of me didn't want to know. I went and got my parents, who didn't bother to check at this point because they didn't see anything the last few times. I kept hearing the knocking for the next few nights after, to the point where I ended up sleeping on the couch. My parents decided to just let me move bedrooms, and so they moved my bedroom into what was the office. After moving bedrooms, I didn't hear anything. It was maybe for a good 3 nights, then I heard it again. The same knocking 3 hard times. This time, I looked out the window. I saw what I would assume was a man, or a very big-built woman, crouching down, wearing a gray hoodie and some dark jeans. I can't recall the color. It was dark, maybe gray or black. I closed the curtains, went and got my parents, and told them all about it. They informed the police. The police couldn't really do anything because we had no solid proof besides my words. They advised we get a camera facing my bedroom and around that area of the house, so that's what we did. I haven't heard any of the knocking since, but I do wonder who it was. Nonetheless, it makes a good story to tell. This happened about a decade ago when I was 19. At the time, I rented an apartment in a west side neighborhood of Chicago with my sister. She was about a year older than me. We both worked hospitality jobs in the city, and we both had pretty robust social lives, so it was fairly typical for one or both of us to get home at weird hours. or be out all night. At this point in my life, I was pretty used to being catcalled walking down the street. I'd been flashed on public transportation a few times. Men would bump into me from behind on packed trains. Basically, the usual amount of sexual harassment for a young woman living in the city. Not much fazed me. Of course, it was uncomfortable, but I was never truly terrified. Until one night. That night, I was coming home from work well after midnight. The train car I was on had been empty for most of the ride. One stop before mine, a man gets on and sits down in my cart. Reflexively, I looked up at this new passenger entering the cart. We made eye contact. Immediately after, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. I knew I'd made a mistake, that this might be interpreted as some sort of invitation. I quickly looked away, but felt him watching me as the train pulled away from the station. Since my stop was only one stop away, I decided to wait until the last second to stand up and exit the car, just in case he tried to follow me. Well, he did. He hung back about 30 feet at first, but I felt the gap between us closing and his footsteps getting louder. Then I hear him trying to catch my attention, saying, "Hey." He catches up to me and starts speaking to me like any other man trying to chat me up would. I still couldn't shake the feeling of genuine fear I had since first locking eyes with him in the train car. He asks me where I'm headed. I told him I was going home. He asked if there was anyone waiting up for me this late. I told him my boyfriend was. In reality, I knew my sister was working a night shift, and I was going home to an empty apartment. Then he pulled his shirt to the side, exposing a gun in his waistband. In a joking tone, he said he'd fight my boyfriend for me. I laughed along, but just kept walking. The street we were walking down is a pretty busy street. Even that late at night, I knew I couldn't let him follow me to my apartment. So when I came to cross the street, where I should have turned, I just kept going straight. Eventually, I had to walk far enough that I passed the stop where he had originally gotten on the train. He walked alongside me for a while, then dropped back to follow me for a while, and eventually stopped. I thought I would be relieved once I'd shaken him, but as soon as I couldn't see him anymore, only my fear was heightened. I still had to double back to my apartment somehow, and the trains had stopped running at 2 a.m. I figured he knew I'd walked too far and would have to turn around. So I thought it was possible he was posted up somewhere on that busy street waiting for me. I turned off and walked a few blocks north, and then started my less than a mile walk back west towards my apartment. The walk back was excruciating. Since I was now off the main road, it was much darker and there was absolutely nobody around. I kept telling myself I had to get home safe for my sister, because she'd never be able to live with herself if something happened to me. I kept putting one foot in front of the other, and when I finally made it to my apartment and locked the doors behind me, I collapsed in a puddle of tears. 10 years later on, I've never felt fear again like I did that night. To this day, I've never told my sister about it. This happened about 8 years ago, and I still think about it on occasion and wonder what happened. The summer between my freshman and sophomore year of high school, there was this boy I liked. Being teenagers, we would sneak out in the middle of the night to this park that was really close to our houses. One night at about 2 a.m, we were sitting on a picnic table at one end of the park. Like we normally would, we did this for months, and it was like any other night. This park is surrounded 3/4 of the way by canyons, and the park has a playground, soccer field, and baseball field. We were just hanging out, and we saw 2 people. A man probably in his 30s, a little heavy-set, wearing a red baseball cap and a white t-shirt. And there was a woman who was a bit younger than him. The boy I was with and I watched the 2 of them walk across the baseball field and into the canyon. We didn't think anything of it, and they were just going to have relations in the canyon. Maybe around 5 minutes later, we started to hear screaming. I was not going crazy because it startled the boy I was with too. It was nothing like I'd ever heard. The screaming was ear-piercing and absolutely horrifying. After about 20 seconds, everything fell silent. We didn't hear anything, but a little while later, maybe a few minutes, the man came walking back out of the creek, but without the girl. He started walking towards where we were sitting, and then we just dipped. We got the hell out of there. We grabbed all of our stuff and ran home. I don't know if he saw us, but we were not sticking around to find out. It was quite dark, so it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't notice anyone there, until he saw two teenagers taking off through the park. For the next 2 to 3 months, I looked all over the internet, and would go and look around the canyon for anything to explain what happened. I never found anything online or in the canyon, and I still have no idea what happened that night. This is probably one of the scariest and creepiest things that has ever happened to me. I would also like to say, I was about 14 or 15 when this happened, and was a selfish teenager preoccupied with himself. So no, I didn't call the police. I should have. I think back on it and beat myself up for not saying anything, but at the time, I was only concerned about getting in trouble for sneaking out with this boy. If this happened today, I would for sure call the police. Not exactly something I saw, but heard and felt. My dad and I went backpacking in the Yosemite National Park in California, and stopped in a valley to camp for the night. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of at least a dozen, what sounded like deer, sprinting right past our tent, followed by a loud thud behind our tent, and then the forest going dead silent. I've been camping my whole life, and never have I heard silence like that in a forest. Not even a leaf was blowing in the wind. Something instinctively inside me made my whole body freeze. I couldn't breathe. Goosebumps, heart racing, literally petrified. I swear on my life, I could hear whatever made that loud thud start tiptoeing around our tent. I say tiptoeing because the steps were so soft and careful. It felt intentional, like it was investigating our tent, and I could feel its presence moving around the tent. After what felt like a lifetime, but was probably only 5 to 10 minutes, a branch snapped somewhere in the forest, followed by a loud whoosh of wind, and the forest just went back to normal. I want to say it was a mountain lion, just curious about our tent or something, and that's what I told myself the rest of our trip so I could sleep that night. But the horrible pit in my stomach, and the fear that washed over me was nothing like I've ever felt before or since, and has convinced me there are things in the forest far worse than people realize. For context, I am a believer in the paranormal, and believe I have had encounters with skinwalkers or something of the sorts in the past. I am also a hunter, fisherman, and general outdoorsman. I've spent countless nights backpacking, camping, hunting, and anything of that sort, so I feel like I have a good understanding of things that go on in the woods. Also, before anyone comments, I have heard many fox, coyote, and hawk calls. I am not discounting that this may be what we were hearing, but I firmly doubt it. Anyways, let's go on to the story. This took place last night. I was camping on the north shore of Lake Superior. I was with 3 of my buddies. 3 of us were camping, and my other friend was sleeping in his truck, about 500 to 600 feet away. We came to this spot after dark, and started setting up camp. Right away, the animals were acting really weird in my opinion. The deer, which we disturbed from their bedding, were very reluctant to leave, running about 30 to 40 feet away and stopping, turning around, and just staring at us. These deer stayed for hours, and while we cooked, played music, and generally enjoyed ourselves, they would one at a time start walking towards our camp. One of these deers would get very close to our camp and seemed to be very annoyed with our presence, staring down our headlamps while walking straight at us. Usually, a deer would get the deer in a headlights effect and be stunned, but this one in specific wouldn't budge. It would walk a straight line right at us, less than 20 feet away, until we would run at it to scare it off. This happened about 5 to 6 times in the span of about an hour. Weird we all thought, as we kind of brushed it off and kept camping. Around 1 a.m., Buddy left for his truck and left the 3 of us out there. My one friend went to lay in his hammock, while me and my other buddies stayed out there to see what was going on. My one friend went to lay in his hammock, while me and my other buddies stayed up to see what was going on. This is when it got really weird. All night, There were eyes surrounding our camp, staying just out of the range of our headlamps, almost 360 around us, staring into our camp. After a while, we freaked out, and I pulled the sage out of my bag and lit it, walking around the camp with it in my hand. About 5 minutes later, once the initial sage burnt out, I looked into the woods and everything was gone. Not one set of eyes were left. We enjoyed the peace and quiet for a while we stayed around the fire talking. This only lasted a little while until we started hearing whistling in the woods, around 2 a.m. now. Every couple of minutes, we would hear a long, drawn-out whistle coming from nearby. Every time it would happen, it would be from a different direction, but it still sounded like it was right next to us. We burnt more sage and tried to ignore it as it kept happening for about 45 minutes. We got really creeped out, and at this point, we started becoming a little more cautious, building the fire a little larger and grasping at our camping knives and hatchets. Once it hit 3:15, my buddy woke up from his hammock, getting up and asking us what time it was. I checked on my watch and said it was 3:15. My buddy checked his phone and confirmed 3:15. We sit up and start talking around the fire for what seems like an hour, maybe longer, maybe less. About an hour passes, and my same friend asks us to check the time. We do so, and my watch clearly says 3:05. I am extremely confused at this point, and before telling him, I ask him to check for himself. He says 3:05 in a very confused manner. This scares the hell out of us, and we decide to start packing it up and get what sleep we can in our vehicles. We started packing up on shifts, the two of them packing up while I stand watch. After they are done packing, I start packing up my things. About 5 minutes into me packing my things, all of a sudden, we stop and hear this drawn-out, shrill screech coming from the woods right next to us. I've never heard anything like this, but it sounded like a young lady in distress. It lasted for about 10 seconds as we all sat quietly and listened. After this, we all looked at each other, wide-eyed and pale-faced. Unanimously, we decide it's time to get the hell out of Dodge. Leaving our things, and we all started sprinting towards the vehicles, checking behind us as we ran. We came back for our things once daylight hit, but didn't have anything else happen. Believe me or not, it doesn't really affect my opinion on what happened. Again, I have spent countless nights in the deep woods and have never experienced anything quite like this. This happened around 2021, and sometimes I still find it hard to grasp. For context, I now live in a different place and along with most of my relatives, so I feel safer saying this on here. The reason I'm posting this is for people to learn and possibly caution themselves from my experience. I'd say the place I lived was just pretty old. It wasn't densely populated nor empty. It had wooded areas around it. You could cycle to the mall, school, and other normal places, but you'd have to take a car to go to places like the hospital. I was basically in my last year of high school. Being an only child and a girl on top of that made my parents overprotective, and I was naturally more cautious than the rest of my friend group. I really didn't mind being that way though, because I always thought it was the better option. So, teenagers from my school would have these outdoor get-togethers in the woods, a few kilometers away from the school. It was just common for people to lounge out and about, chilling till 3 a.m. or something. Including me, it was a group of 4. They decided it was the last year and we should probably drink together in the woods. Obviously, looking back, it was a stupid idea. But it wasn't unsafe, and it wasn't deep in the woods either. There's a pretty clear trail and a small open area where people would take their dogs and whatnot. We planned to do it on a Thursday night because my parents would be out, and the rest would convince their parents we're having a sleepover. We bought alcohol and some other stuff just to chill out. There was no others, and that was because it was a weekday and quite chilly as well. It was pretty lively, and you could see houses from the distance and people would be driving around, so naturally, we felt safe. We walked on the trail for about 1 minute when I felt uneasy. I felt like we were being watched or something like that, and looked over to one of my friends. She also looked a little distressed, but we just shrugged it off. We walked only a few minutes and we found our spot. We started drinking and basically spent about an hour and 30 minutes gossiping and having deep talks while being drunk. I didn't drink too much and neither did my other friend. We were just a little tipsy. We forgot about the brief, weird feeling we had felt while walking until we heard something from the thick of the trees in front of us. Even though we were loud, we all heard it. It was this weird giggle. I got up from the tree log I was sitting on and dragged my other friends back a little. We had a fire going and 2 torches, but still couldn't really see into that area. It wasn't that close to us. Think about 4 doors away if you place them horizontally, so the fact that we heard the laugh was just insane to me. I pointed the flashlight straight into the area, and no one came out. I sat back down, and when I turned the flashlight off, there was a silhouette coming out. I switched on the flashlight to blind the person, while my other friends did the same. We started yelling and getting ready to run, when I saw the most horrifying sight of my life. It was this man who we'd never seen before. He had this plaster smile, and his hair was covered in dirt. He was pale, and his eyes were almost like it wasn't looking at us, but just in our general direction. I can't explain, but it was just textbook creepy. We all ran for it. My very drunk friends even managed to snap out of it. We got to my house, as I lived closer to the place, and said that we'd call the cops. We were scared of our parents, but it didn't matter. We called the cops, and they found nothing. Word got out, and people pretty much strayed away from the paths at night, and a couple of the guys in our school managed to get their dads with all of their guns to find the guy, but nothing ever came of it. Fast forward to like a month later. We didn't talk about it much and never did anything like that again. I got a pocket knife and pepper spray to keep. I went home after school and was exhausted, so I decided to take a nap. My dad was at work and my mom was visiting her sister. I suddenly woke up to this weird sound. We had a 1-story and the walls were not too thick. I locked all of the doors and even the windows out of habit, still fearing for the worst. I locked my room door and kind of looked out of my window. There was nothing. I grabbed a bat and my phone. Heading out of my room, I looked at all of the doors and everything was locked. There was this weird thing, like shuffling out of my house, and I just looked out of the window of my living room. I kid you not, it was the same dude from the woods. He was just outside, walking in this erratic, eerie way, which just sent me into a spiral. He somehow saw me and started saying, "Hi there." Very loudly, I called the police, and then I told him to F off. After that, he started saying my name, and all of my friends' names. The police questioned him, and he had no history of mental illness. And after enough interrogation, he confessed to liking younger women. He is in jail now, and will probably get out in a couple years. My dad has a friend who's a cop, and the cop told him the guy would scream when they asked him things. He was also guilty of attempted sexual assault and harassment, but that's all I know of. In summer 2019, my partner and I, both early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and then stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We liked camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different and make the most of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the US, and it seemed like a crazy new experience. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, and it was close to the water, Alouette Lake. We packed terribly, had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruit and veggies to eat healthy, stored them in a cooler that was too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up the snacks while driving. Canada was the best part, and Alouette Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold lake. We hiked around, saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pics of each other for an hour. And we started modeling the same poses from far away. Everything was perfect, and the campsite was empty except for the other couple. We went to bed early that night. It was quiet, and I woke up to crackling outside of the tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black and probably an animal. The crackling continued, getting closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right outside of our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. They woke up, and I said there was someone outside of the tent. Then I hear footsteps, quiet footsteps, walking out of our campsite. My partner starts loudly saying, "What?" repeatedly in the sleepy haze. A car or truck is parked right outside of our camping area. No one is near our campsite. It starts up and then drives off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned the corner and when we were out of view. So I couldn't make out much, but it looked like a truck. Now I'm shaking, and my partner can't put together what's happening. I want to leave, but Golden Ears locks the gates until 6 or 7 a.m., and it's 1 a.m., so we're going to be here till then. I made us move to the Ford Fiesta and sleep in the tightly packed car. She falls asleep immediately and thinks I'm paranoid. Could it have been a park ranger? It seemed too weird of behavior for a park ranger. I sit there wide awake for about 2 hours. The car is locked and I want to sleep, but I can't. I'm in the passenger seat. My partner's in the driver's seat, and now it's 3 a.m. I'm sitting half awake. I hear a car slowly drive up the road, lights off, and it rounds the corner. It had to be the same truck, and I was scared, but my adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounds the corner and pulls up directly in front of our campsite. Again, in the same spot. I feel like I'm gonna throw up. I had no weapon but the kitchen knife we brought for fruits and veggies. So I grabbed the knife and tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sit straight up in the passenger seat, holding the kitchen knife. I kept it straight up at eye level and stared deadpan out at this truck in the pitch black. The truck stops and turns off. A light shines directly into my face coming from the inside of the truck, and I stare back, terrified, in my bright red Ford Fiesta, holding my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck starts up and turns on its lights, and they stay on, blinding me, and then the truck pulled out and turns around and goes back from where it came. My heart is pounding, and I wake up my partner and say we need to get the hell out of here. We pack up by just throwing things into the car, and we sit there awake until 6 a.m. We drive straight home and don't stop. We keep rehashing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decide that we both need some sleep. This happened to my mom maybe 3 years ago. My mom has now passed away, but she was maybe 40 at the time. She was a very pretty woman and looked young for her age. She often had total strangers propose to her. Everyone was pretty much obsessed with her. That being said, she was no stranger to dealing with creeps. One day, she was at Woodman's, a grocery store for those who don't know. It wasn't really in a bad area, but was close to a bad area and was right off the freeway, so it could be kind of sketchy. She always told me she didn't want me going there alone, especially at night. When I would go with her at night, I was not to leave her side, even though I was 18 to 20 years old at the time. She was there during the day, doing her grocery shopping alone. She noticed a man in the same aisle as her. He was looking at her, and when she would turn to look at him, he would look away and act like he was looking at something on the shelves. Honestly, she didn't think much of it. As I mentioned, she has dealt with her fair share of creeps. So she grabbed what she needed and moved on to another aisle. This is when she noticed him again, in the same aisle doing the same thing. This time it kind of rubbed her the wrong way, but she went about her business and again moved on. The man kept following her throughout the store. Now it's worth mentioning that my mom is not one to be messed with. She was very confrontational, never backed away from a fight. She has beaten the crap out of men, but also taken beatings from men. Usually she carried a weapon. So as she's getting ready to check out, he's still following her. Now she's pretty pissed off and doesn't feel safe leaving. She alerted an employee who went to get a manager. My mom took this opportunity to tell him off, saying something like, "Can I help you? What the F do you want?" He replied to her by saying, "You look like the kind of girl who would look really good in someone's basement." At this point, she was not only mad, but absolutely terrified. The manager came, and while my mom was telling them about the guy and what he had just said, he ran off. The police were called, and they were able to locate him in or around the building. They escorted him off the property, but that was all. My mom was afraid that the guy was lurking somewhere, waiting to see her get into her car and then proceed to follow her. She ended up calling me in tears, saying she was afraid, and if she was going to be followed or abducted, she wanted someone to know, so she and I stayed on the phone till she was home. It took a lot to shake or scare my mom, but she had really good intuition, so for her to be as shaken as she was, he had to be as creepy as they come. And his comment only further proved that. In the end, she was okay, but I can't imagine what would have happened if she didn't tell someone, or if he did wait and followed her home. My parents divorced in 2006 when I was 17, and they split right before their 18th anniversary. It was a long time coming. My dad sustained a head injury 4 years prior, so his drinking and drug use went from a lot to a cyclone of crazy. So my mom risked it and left. Dad left and we remained in the same house, and we had moved from our small town to a city near our state's capital. It was weird. But the first month he was gone, we had a peace we never knew we could have, and I remember feeling actually free for the first time in my life. My dad had to be supervised by the state police when he collected his stuff, as he was violent and threatened to kill me on several occasions. He never cleared out the basement, but left the garage, and so my mom, myself, and some friends that I hung out with at the time helped the cleanup efforts. We ended up getting $200 in return from the beer cans. My friends and I got different furniture, instruments, stereos, and a fridge to put soda and beers in as we took over the garage and basement. My friends and I discovered my dad had been growing weed in the basement as he left all of his plants and equipment behind. At the time, it was illegal in my state. My mom has a job where she could get fired and lose her license as well. My friends and I didn't want to get involved with selling any of it, and we honestly were just interested in having fun on our own terms. We liked to drink, but beyond that, it never got into anything more. So we threw it all out. My dad had told us he got everything, and that was it. I would never have to interact with him, really, and he gave me up during the family court stuff, so we thought. Our house is on a hill and borders the actual city, which has alleyway access which leads to the small backyard. The basement access was outside only, and was kept with a padlock, and the door itself was pretty sturdy. The house was next to a diner and a storage garage, so everything was closed after 5 p.m. There was other houses on the street as well, and is a main drag that connects you to a small highway. I don't remember when it started, but I recall my dad would call the house nightly, drunk, and accuse my mom of cheating, as he was already living with another woman at the time as well. Then we started having people prowl around the house. It started very subtly, until my special needs sister started seeing a ski-masked man out her window. I would often chase someone away with a bat some nights, alone by myself, or watching my sister as my mom had to work multiple jobs. I started working as well. I would often wait up most nights and would just patrol making sure everyone was safe, and most nights it was nothing. I developed a good layer of trauma from all of this, and a caffeine addiction, as I was always on alert. I had suspected a few of my dad's friends, especially since they were very interested in the basement. I am not a small person. I'd given up playing football and had trained to play for a D1 school, so I was still fresh from all of it and was still very strong. One night in particular, I remember being awoken by my bedroom window being tampered with. I looked and saw a man in a ski mask trying to open my window with a large hunting knife in his mouth. I snuck down on the floor and crawled out of my room and into the living room. I grabbed the bat I kept by the front door. I got my shoes and jacket on as it was winter. I snuck outside and confronted the man who I recognized as one of my dad's friends. He started talking crap and making fun of me, but I warned him he needed to leave or I would hurt him. He took a swing at me with the knife, and I pulled back and cracked him on the shoulder as hard as I could. I could hear bones break. I watched his shoulder move in an unnatural way as he fell down in the snow. I got on top of him and started punching him over and over, taking the ski mask off. My mom and the neighbors came out as he stopped moving and was unconscious. It took my mom and 5 others to pull me off of him, and they had a hard time. As we waited for the cops, he came to and managed to get up, and he tried to run but was having a hard time. A car came and he hopped in and took off before we could stop him. This was before Ring doorbells and most people had security systems. We all gave our story, and the cops took his knife, and that was it. Things were quiet for a while, before it started again that summer. I had cornered the same guy in the dark in that small yard. He yelled out that he wanted his equipment from the basement, and I told him I tossed it, and he charged at me. I picked up a large garden brick we had piled back there, and tossed it over at him, and hit him in the same place I did months prior. I heard bones break again. This time, I sat on him as he kicked and screamed. My mom called the cops, and they came and actually arrested him. They told me that I had broken his collarbone and that he wanted to press charges. Nothing ever came of it, and after which the whole situation ended up blowing over, and it all stopped. My dad admitted he was involved and wasn't sorry that he pitted these men against his kids and ex-wife. This altered my relationship with him. I saw that man during the pandemic as our city had a lot of public gatherings and such. And while I'm not the same person, I was very happy to see him have a level of healthy fear. This happened to me and my current boyfriend about 2 years ago. We live in a city that has a main downtown area. The main city is pretty liberal, but once you get out into the county, it can become quite the opposite. That being said, the main city, and especially the downtown area, has a pretty bad homeless problem that has only gotten worse over the years. For the most part, the homeless population is pretty harmless. They know the good spots to hang out. A lot of the times, they just smile at you, and I always smile back. Sadly, there has been an increase of incidents, infer what you will, in the last few years with the rise of overdoses and more addictive street drugs. I was living in the main downtown area at the time, having just recently graduated college and wanting to be closer to the nightlife. My best friend that I met in college and I were roommates. We have an apartment right in the middle of downtown. It was the perfect setup. My boyfriend, let's call him Jack, happened to just live 1 block down, and then 5 or 6 blocks south of that. It was about a 10-minute walk, give or take. It was even closer to the heart of downtown as well, so you can imagine how convenient that made it for hanging out, and also not having to take a car and worry about parking. One overcast Sunday morning, my boyfriend and I woke up at my place, and decided to walk over to his so that he could grab some things. We had walked the majority of the way. It really was just a straight walk on the sidewalks the whole time. We were on the right side of the road with the street to our left. We're not even 1 minute away from my boyfriend's place, when I notice something ahead that makes me feel a bit uneasy. First off, there's a guy walking in front of us in the same direction we are, with his back to us. I can see that he has both earbuds in. He's walking at about the same pace, so we aren't about to run into him or anything. In front of him, facing and walking towards all of us, is a different guy. He had a small frame, was maybe 5'8", wearing dark pants, a red sweatshirt with his hood up, and a backpack. Even though his hood was up, I could see his face. Some short black hair poked out, pale skin, and these black, beady, crazy eyes that I'll never forget. I assumed him to be homeless, as it was in an area that was popular for them. Now, he wasn't looking at us, but rather the pedestrian with the earbuds in who happened to be closer to him and in front of us. All of a sudden, I see the homeless guy run and quite literally rush the pedestrian in front of us. Like, ran up and then stopped about half a foot from this poor dude's face. Since the guy had his headphones in, he probably just wanted to mind his own business and walk home quietly. He was clearly taken by surprise and stopped and took one of his earbuds out to see what this crazy dude wanted. While I'm a risk taker, I don't like putting myself in the wrong place when I don't need to be. This freaked me out and I didn't want this guy to notice us and come at us next, so I stepped left off the sidewalk and into the street. There was a pretty big lane for street parking, and it was lined with parked cars, so I conveniently hid myself from view behind a car as I continued walking. heard this guy start yelling death threats at the poor pedestrian, like how he was going to run him over with a car and he's going to find him. Like I said, we were not 100 feet from the entrance to my boyfriend's apartment at this point, and after witnessing that, I just wanted to be inside. My boyfriend had continued walking on the sidewalk, and in an instant, I had come back into view, and we turned right towards the apartment. Now, the apartment did have a main entrance from the street side on the sidewalk, but my boyfriend had just moved in and didn't have the code to the front door yet. All he had was his fob to the parking garage that led to the stairwell up into the place. We were using that at the time to get in. We walked into the parking garage door and clicked the button so it would start rolling up. I hadn't looked behind me at that point. I knew I probably should have, but a lot of the times, if you ignore the crazy people, for lack of better words, they will in turn not bother you. So I was kind of following that tactic at the moment. The garage door was open and we went inside. My boyfriend clicked the button to close it. The garage door was nearly closed, and I don't know what prompted me to look back, but I did. And what I saw still gives me chills to this day. It was the homeless guy from the street. He was squeezing under the garage door while he still could. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as I locked eyes with him, and I yelled at my boyfriend, "Jack, he's following us." I'm not sure what I expected my boyfriend to do, but he pushed the door to the stairwell open and started running. That was the moment where I realized this guy had access inside, because the door to the stairwell didn't require a fob or have a lock. Me, definitely not wanting to be the closest one to this guy, took off running after my boyfriend. As I pushed the door open and got inside the stairwell, I could hear the guy behind me doing the same thing as it was swinging back closed. I looked back and locked eyes with this crazy guy once again, and I realized my only option was to keep running and try and get inside of our apartment and close the door before he got there. Yes, this guy was smaller, but what really freaked me out is since he had a backpack, I had no idea if he had a knife or a gun in there. Why else would you chase two people and outnumber yourself? My boyfriend lived on the 3rd floor, of course, so we proceeded to sprint up 3 flights of stairs. I could hear this guy's pounding footsteps behind me. At last, we got to our level and opened the door to the hallways and sprinted to his unit without looking back. We unlocked the door as fast as we could. It still felt slower than hell to this day, and slammed the door shut behind us. I remember looking through the peephole and expecting to see the guy standing there ready to yell at us, but nothing. My heart was pounding. I mean, what just happened? We called the cops and told them what happened to us. I'll admit, they probably did all they could, but it didn't feel like enough. I was freaked out. This dude had access to and was inside the building with access to all the apartments and residents. I just imagined him hiding in the stairwell for the next poor soul. Well, the cops came, drove around the perimeter of the complex for a few minutes, but weren't able to search inside the building apparently, because they didn't have access, and we weren't allowed to let them in, and left after not finding anyone. It took me forever to get the urge to finally leave the apartment and go run some Sunday errands, but we did. I'm sure the guy was just high on drugs and decided to be crazy that morning and bother some unlucky people. He probably left after he realized he was screwed if people find him there, and someone else called the cops. This story happened recently, and for some context, me and my friends are teens that like to explore and do stupid things like normal teenagers do. We found this tunnel that had a drain under a busy road. We had to crouch and sit on our skateboards to explore it since the height of the tunnel was short. As we were going deeper into the tunnel, it gets pitch black and the flashlights from our phones could only reach about 5 feet in front of us. So we were blind to what we could come across until we were very close to it. In the tunnel, I remember the wall was painted in all red and had sheets of metal with white handprints, connected to clothespins. We decided to keep going until we reached what we thought was a dead end. It was not. On the left was a more square tunnel compared to the rectangle shape we were in. In the distance of the connected tunnel was a bright light coming from the outside, shining from above onto a red shopping cart with belongings on it. We slowly inched towards the light where the shopping cart was. The light turned out to be a big hole in the ground that we could crawl out of if we needed to escape. As we were about to pass the shopping cart, my friend was in the lead and was too scared to go forward anymore. It was pitch black, 5 feet from where we were. I decided to take the lead and kept going. I stepped past the shopping cart and stopped. I don't know what it was, but I was afraid. I had a gut feeling something was back there. I slowly moved back. I stopped. I swear I could have saw something moving from the deep dark of the tunnel. Before I could put everything back together, a loud echo of someone pounding an object on the walls of the tunnel struck me back, causing everyone to freak out and crawl out of the escape hole. Once we got out, a homeless man ran to us, asking what we were doing down there. We told him we were just exploring. He explained to us that there is a man that lives underground in that tunnel, and he would have killed us if we went any further. The man was apparently crazy and threw a rock at the poor guy's head before. Luckily, no one was hurt, and even though it was scary and dangerous, it was fun, and I'm glad we experienced it. This event happened when I was 16. Currently, I'm 18. Our home had to have some renovations, so the builders tell us that the renovation will only take about a month. We were able to live in an Airbnb that is thankfully in the same neighborhood as us. I take the bus to and from school, and it was a very long walk to the bus stop from the new location. One thing about me is that I have a very poor sense of direction. Even if I've been taking the same road for years, it's still a possibility that I'll forget the way. So I was lost walking home one day and accidentally found another route on the way from the Airbnb to the bus stop, which added another 10 minutes to an about 20-minute walk. This is important for context of the story. So one day, I'm walking home from the bus stop, and I'm cursing myself out because it's minus 20-something, and I've accidentally taken the longer route. This is when I first notice a middle-aged man, a good distance behind me. At first I shrugged it off because he wasn't very close at all, but I began to get concerned because the route I was taking is not a regular one. It's one where you have to cut between houses, and it seemed too large of a coincidence. And he is constantly behind me, even on the absurd route I'm taking. At this point, I'm scared, but I don't want to alert him because it's winter, it's getting dark out, and I'm not strong, so my chances of overpowering a grown man are slim to none. I pick up my pace, increasing the already pretty large distance between us. So as soon as I round the corner, there is a fence surrounding the Airbnb, and there is a gate that breaks up the fence that leads into the neighborhood where the house is. This is technically the back way, and you're not supposed to cross the gate. He has not rounded the corner yet, as he is a bit further behind me. So at this point, I sprint like my life depends on it down the sidewalk, and duck under the gate and hide behind the fence. I then climb the porch stairs and peek across the fence. It's in a position where I can see the road and sidewalk, but they cannot see me. He bursts from around the fence, running, probably because the distance between us has grown too large, and he stopped in his tracks when he didn't see me. I watched him pull out his phone and start talking. Then he goes back the way he came. Until this day, I'm not sure if it was paranoia or if he genuinely had bad intentions. I'm still glad that there was such a distance between us. It was the only way I was able to run off unnoticed by him. I'm a paranormal investigator as a hobby. I've been doing it for years and I'm in love with the science behind it. However, I'm also a hardened skeptic, and will do everything in my power to explain what may be happening in a logical way. I've seen a lot I can't explain, but mostly things that don't bother me. However, there have been a couple that have legitimately frightened me. I was out investigating an abandoned motel in the middle of the night, out in the middle of the desert. It's just a random place that we found. No claims, no story behind it, just a random building about a 2-hour drive from any civilization. When you walked in, it was very obvious that people were living there at one point. with food containers and trash nearly covering the floors. When exploring abandoned places like this, I am always armed. Ghosts can't hurt you, however people and animals can, and often people are more frightening. After making sure the location was clear and safe, I felt comfortable enough to go into the basement of the structure alone. It was a very old and crumbling basement with shelves lining it, and I had to be careful on the stairs because they were all falling apart. I sat myself down on the floor, turned off my light, fired up my recorder, and began to ask some basic questions. I was there for a good half an hour before I gave up. Nothing was happening, and I wanted to go back to the others. When I stood up, I suddenly began hearing rustling from the opposite corner of the basement, behind the shelves. I turned around and pointed my flashlight over there, but couldn't see anything as it continued. I reached down and grabbed a stone, throwing it into the corner to see if it was an animal. However, it didn't stop. At that point, I drew my firearm from my side and called out, letting whatever it was know that I was armed and that they needed to come out. Still, nothing changed. I got a call on my radio from my buddy, asking where I was. I told him that I was in the basement and told him what was happening so he knew to head over to me. At that point, I backed up to the stairs, and once I reached them, the noise stopped completely. It was dead silent. I looked at the corner for a bit longer, seeing if there was anything that would move before I turned to walk up the stairs. And that's when it happened. Large, heavy footsteps came from behind me, moving quickly and were on top of me within an instant. I jumped and bolted up the stairs, racing to the top before turning around and pointing my gun down with my flashlight. I knew that was a person. It had to be, but there was absolutely nothing at the bottom of the stairs, and everything was silent again. I ended up going back to the car and needing a moment after that. I was shaken up pretty good, and to this day, I have no idea what in the hell tried to jump me down in the basement, because my friend went down there right after and told me it was completely empty. Allow me to set the scene. After my freshman year of college, my randomly assigned roommate turned best friend, and another girl on our floor who we became very close with in the dorms, all decided to rent a house together the following year. The other girl's stepdad flipped houses and had recently renovated this place that was 2 blocks from campus. The house itself was gorgeous, with a sunroom, a basement with a washer-dryer, 2 beds on the main floor with a bathroom, basically an upstairs suite with a huge master and walk-in closet, and a private bath. The other girl took the whole floor to herself since it was her dad's place, and didn't pay any rent because her family thought she was too busy with cheerleading in her sorority. That's a whole separate conversation leading up to why my best friend and I moved out. The important thing is, my friend and I had the 2 main levels just off the living room with a bathroom between us. I don't even remember when the paranormal experiences started. I remember by October, we moved in August. It was enough that our dumb asses did a seance and had already named our ghost Claire. With the windows closed, we asked her a bunch of questions, and she moved the candle in different directions for a yes and no. Things were really bad for my friend, and mildly annoying for me. This all happened on the main level, and the third girl never experienced anything. My friend would experience sleep paralysis frequently, and wake up to a woman sitting on top of her, or see her standing in the corner nearest to the closet. The sink in the bathroom between our rooms would go on and off all night. For me, she would open my door and get into bed with me. The funny thing is, at first, I didn't even realize it was a ghost doing that. After a while, when I would feel the weight pushing down in the bed, I would kept turning around and no one was there. I'd turn my back, and a second later, the weight would get closer to me, turn around, and nothing. I worked 12-hour shifts on Saturdays, and I would be so exhausted, I would just let it happen. It was so frequent, it wouldn't even be worth the fight to get up and close my door or roll over and check the bed. I only saw her once. I was home alone and deep cleaning my room. The light was on in the living room, and my room was creating some sort of triangle of darkness in that short hallway. I was pulling the vacuum out of my room when, in the corner of my eye, a woman with dark hair was standing behind me. Both my roommates had dark hair. She was so real that I jumped and turned around and said, "Oh my god, you scared me." As I was turning around and when I finished turning, no one was there. That was the first time Claire actually spooked me. My friend and I moved out a few months later due to a lot of issues with the third roommate. In the years following, whenever the experience gets brought up, my friend is nearly in tears about the terror that Claire put her through at night, where I joke often about how I had a ghost girlfriend cuddling with me at night. I don't know why she was so nice to me. In some ways, I feel bad that she revealed herself to me, and I was scared of her. She seemed harmless, just active. Then again, she was so awful to my friend, and that's also unexplainable. I think the funniest part of this story, though, is when constantly living with an active entity, you do eventually get used to whatever they're doing. Between nursing school and my friends and my class, plus 30 hours a week of work at a standing job, at some point, I need sleep no matter who's in bed. This story takes place in Raleigh, North Carolina. There is a nature reserve area near my old neighborhood that I used to frequent with friends that became our unofficial hangout and smoke spot. The nature reserve is called Shank Forest. The area is owned and managed by North Carolina State University and is home to some veterinary school horses. It also operates as a teaching and research site for most university forest management programs. The land itself has an interesting history prior to it being utilized for university purposes, as there was a prison farm on the land pre-1930s. When visiting this area, even prior to this experience, my friend and I would always joke about how the land had a strange energy or feel to it. In the parking area of the reserve, there was a small graveyard and abandoned house, which certainly further contributes to the interesting vibes. However, I never felt scared or uncomfortable in the space, and would often go to the area alone. Now here's the actual story. One night, I was about to meet up with my friend at the Nature Reserve Park. She was getting off work that night, and I ended up beating her there. While waiting for her, I parked my car off the side of the road and turned it around to face the direction in which you would enter the park area. Behind me was the graveyard, and I could see the area decently well in the rear view of my left side mirror. It was important to mention that my car was the only car there, and that there was no other humans in sight. The time was just past 7 in the middle of October, and the sun was almost completely set, and it was starting to get dark outside. After arriving at the park, I sat in my car for a few minutes on my phone, trying to kill time while waiting for my friend. After sitting there for a moment, something caught my eye in the side mirror of my car. In the graveyard area behind my vehicle, there was a small fire that had started on the ground. My immediate reaction was to get out of the car and stomp out the flames, and that is exactly what I did. I found it a bit odd that a fire had started, seemingly out of nowhere, but presumed someone had tossed a cigarette out before I arrived. The fire was in an area where there were dry leaves on the ground, so this was a plausible explanation for the time. After stomping the small fire out, I got back into my car and continued scrolling on my phone. It was almost completely dark outside at this point, and the sun had gone beneath the horizon. Again, something caught my eye in the side of the mirror of my car. The fire had seemingly reappeared instantaneously. I immediately presumed that I'd failed to put it out the first time, and got out of my vehicle once again to put out the flames. Upon getting out of the car, I quickly realized that this fire was separate from the first one that I had put out. It had started approximately a foot behind where the charred spot was in the leaves where the first fire was. After realizing that the ground had spontaneously caught fire not once, but twice, in a graveyard at night, I started to get a little creeped out and sped-walked back to my car to leave. I didn't bother putting out the second fire. Just as I put the car into drive, I glanced back into my rear view to witness a third fire spontaneously start just behind the second fire, of which was still burning. This time, I saw the fire begin with my very own eyes. The next time that I returned to the area after this experience, the ground was still charred in 3 places, in a perfectly vertical line. This occurrence was not a figment of my imagination or a delusion, and I never have heard of or experienced anything like this in the years after this. Ever since I had this experience, I've been trying to come up with a reasonable explanation on how this could have happened, but I've been entirely unable to do so. There were no other humans around, and with the sun being down, there is no plausible way that these fires could have just been brush fires started by sunlight. I'm not religious, and I do not actively practice spirituality, but I feel like these spontaneous fires were a sign that I was unwelcome there, or at least at the time.